But he did not live long enough to restore to every rightful owner his due, as he had wished. And so those who came after him followed the path of Umayyah, not the path of Umar. Then came the Abbasids as kings, and by that time the land had become corrupted, and the people had drifted far from the traditions of religion due to the long estrangement imposed upon them by the Umayyads. Nor were the kings of Banu al-Abbas any better than the kings of Banu Umayyah, for indeed it was the same oppressive kingship. And since our concern here is not to chronicle the history of the Islamic State, but rather to trace the spirit of Islam in governance, we seek to highlight the manifestations of transformation and decline in this spirit by presenting 3 sermons from the era of kingship and comparing them with the 3 sermons that preceded them from the era of the caliphs. Thus, the profound difference shall become evident. Muawiyah addressed the people of Kufa after the treaty, saying, "O people of Kufa, do you think that I fought you so that you might pray or pay zakah or perform hajj? For I know well that you do all these things. Rather, I fought you only to gain power over you and to rule over your necks, and God has granted me that, though you dislike it. Indeed, every wealth or bloodshed that has occurred in this strife is now null and void, and every condition I have stipulated lies beneath these 2 feet of mine." And he also addressed the people of Medina, saying, "Now then, by God, I did not assume this authority because of any love I perceived from you, nor because of any joy on your part at my rule. Rather, I wrested it from you with this sword of mine, struggling against you with all my might. I forced myself to follow the way of Ibn Abi Quafa, Abu Bakr, and I wanted to follow the way of Umar, but my soul recoiled from it with great aversion. Then I sought to follow the ways of Uthman, but it refused me that as well. So I took a path that would bring benefit to both me and you, one of mutual dining in comfort and pleasant companionship in drink. And if you do not find me to be the best among you, yet I remain your ruler." And then came Al-Mansur of the Abbasids, by which time the influence of the Umayyads had so deeply shaped the perception of governance that, in the days of the Abbasids, it had led to the doctrine of divine right, a concept utterly foreign to Islam. And he said, "O people, I am but the sovereign of God upon his earth, governing you by his guidance and his support. I am his guardian over his wealth, disposing of it by his will and his command. He has made me its keeper. If he wills to open it for you, he opens it through me to distribute your sustenance, and if he wills to withhold it, he withholds it through me." And thus the governance of the state was entirely severed from Islam and its teachings. As for financial policy, it followed the course of political governance, being but a branch of the ruler's perception of the nature and function of leadership, and of the rights of both ruler and ruled. In the time of Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his 2 companions, and in the caliphate of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the prevailing view was the Islamic one, that public wealth belonged to the community, and that neither the ruler nor his kin had any right to take from it except in accordance with justice. The ruler was entitled only to his rightful share, no more than what was due to any other citizen. Even when Uthman began to grant favours in wealth, the people's rights remained intact, and he understood himself to be at liberty, since the treasury had expanded beyond the fixed allocations to distribute wealth according to his own discretion, benefiting his kin and those he deemed worthy. But when governance transformed into hereditary kingship, the barriers and restraints collapsed. The ruler became absolute in his power to give or withhold, sometimes acting justly, but more often acting otherwise. The wealth of the Muslims was drained into the luxuries of the rulers, their children, their courtiers, and their sycophants without limit. And in this, the rulers completely abandoned all the guidelines of Islam regarding wealth. This is but a broad depiction, which we shall now illustrate with specific historical examples. Since the days of the Messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, the revenues of the public treasury were as follows. 1. Zakah, the obligatory alms upon the wealth of the Muslims, levied according to its known categories: gold and silver, crops and fruits, livestock and trade goods, as well as found treasure, rikaz. The general rate averaged 1/2 of 1/10, and it was spent in the 8 prescribed avenues. 2. Jizya, the head tax agreed upon with non-Muslim subjects in return for their exemption from military service and the zakah levied upon Muslims. 3. Fay, which comprised the wealth that came to the Muslims from the disbelievers without war. All of it belonged to God, His Messenger, the relatives, the orphans, the needy, and the wayfarers, as explicitly stated in the Quran, 59:7. 4. Ghanima, the spoils of war taken from the disbelievers in battle. 4/5 were for the soldiers, while 1/5 was distributed like fay. 5. Kharaj, a tax upon lands originally held by disbelievers and seized in war, or left in their possession through treaties following the system instituted by Umar ibn al-Khattab in the lands of Persia. In the days of the Messenger, the treasury was not abundant, for the emigrants had left behind their homes and wealth, and the helpers shared with them in brotherhood. The number of Muslims was still small, and before military campaigns, the only revenue was voluntary charity. But when the expeditions began, and Zakah was ordained in the 2nd year after the Hijrah, the treasury gained its primary source of revenue. Another source was the spoils of war, of which 4/5 were granted to the fighters. The Prophet, peace be upon him, would grant 1 share to each foot soldier and 2 or 3 shares to each cavalryman, recognizing both the individual's effort and his contribution. He also granted 1 share to the unmarried and 2 to the married, acknowledging their respective needs. As for the 5th portion, it was distributed according to the prescribed categories. The first instance of fay occurred in the campaign against Banu al-Nadir, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, granted it exclusively to the emigrants, save for 2 poor helpers. Then the Quran established the general principle, so that it may not merely circulate among the rich among you. 59:7. As the Muslim lands expanded and conquests followed one after another, prosperity gradually reached all Muslims equally, for they were all partners in the public treasury, sharing in the allocations set by Islam. When the Messenger, peace be upon him, passed to the Most High, and some among the tribes apostatized and refused zakah, Abu Bakr stood with unwavering resolve and declared, "By God, if they withhold from me even a rope that they used to give to the Messenger of God, I will fight them for withholding it." This was in opposition to Umar ibn al-Khattab, who initially believed that they should not be fought since they still proclaimed there is no God but God. He even said with some vehemence, "How can we fight those who say, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God? For did not the Prophet say, I have been commanded to fight the people until they say, there is no God but God. Whoever says it has protected his wealth and life from me, except by the right of Islam, and his reckoning is with God." But Abu Bakr, with firm conviction, responded, "By God, I will fight those who separate prayer from zakah, for zakah is the right due upon wealth." Then Umar said, "By God, when I saw that God had opened Abu Bakr's heart to battle, I knew it was the truth." Thus, it was decisively established in the historical reality of Islam that the right of the community to wealth within the limits set by God was to be upheld even by force if necessary. Thus, Umar abandoned his initial stance of differentiating between Muslims in the distribution of stipends when he witnessed its dangerous consequences, reverting instead to the opinion of Abu Bakr. Likewise, Ali's position aligned with that of the first caliph. We incline to regard Ali's caliphate as a natural continuation of the rule of the 2 preceding caliphs, whereas the era of Uthman, dominated by Marwan, was an interval between them. For this reason, we shall continue our discussion with the time of Ali before returning to examine the state of affairs during Uthman's rule. Ali upheld the principle of equality in the distribution of wealth, a principle he explicitly proclaimed in his inaugural sermon, saying, "Lo, any man from among the Muhajirun, emigrants, and the Ansar, helpers, the companions of the Messenger of God, who believes that his companionship with the Prophet grants him superiority over others, let him know that true merit lies with God alone, and its reward and recompense rest with him. And lo, Any man who has responded to God and his messenger, who has affirmed our faith, entered our religion, and turned towards our Qibla, has thereby earned the rights and responsibilities of Islam. You are all servants of God, and the wealth belongs to God. It shall be distributed among you equally, with no preference granted to one over another, and the God-conscious shall have with God the best of rewards. This is the sound Islamic principle, one that resonates with the spirit of Islamic equality and ensures balance within the Muslim community. It prevents the unchecked accumulation of wealth, except in proportion to one's effort and labour alone, without privileging some with opportunities unavailable to others, opportunities that arise simply from possessing an excess of wealth with which to invest and trade on a scale beyond the means of others. Towards the end of his life, Umar had begun to incline towards this principle. Yet fate intervened before he could implement his resolve. Indeed, he had firmly intended, nay, he had two firm resolutions. The first, to reclaim the surplus wealth of the affluent and redistribute it among the poor, for this excess had largely resulted from his differential distribution of stipends, and the second, to ensure absolute equality in allocations, so that these disparities would not resurface as they had, nor would the integrity of the Muslim community be destabilized as it had begun to be. Then came Uthman, may God be pleased with him, who chose not to act upon either of these resolves. He left the surplus wealth in the hands of its possessors, neither reclaiming nor redistributing it, and he maintained the differential stipends as they were. But this was not all. In the allocation of wealth, he introduced further measures that exacerbated disparities. The rich grew ever wealthier, while the poor, though they may have seen slight relief, remained largely unchanged. He began granting enormous sums to those who were already affluent, and he permitted the Qurayshite elite to traverse the lands and engage in trade with their amassed fortunes, multiplying their wealth many times over. Furthermore, he allowed the wealthy to acquire vast estates and grand residences, both in the fertile lands of Iraq and elsewhere. Thus, by the end of his caliphate, may God have mercy on him, Islamic society had come to be dominated by vast financial inequalities. Abu Bakr and Umar before him had exercised great vigilance in restraining the Qurayshite elite in Medina, preventing them from dispersing across the newly conquered lands. Their caution stemmed from the concern that these notables, by virtue of their lineage to the Prophet, or their early sacrifices in Islam and in battle, might develop ambitions for wealth and power. This was not an infringement upon personal freedom, for in Islam freedom is bounded by the well-being of the community and the imperative of sincere counsel. But when Uthman assumed leadership, he granted them liberty to roam. Not only this, but he facilitated and even encouraged them to invest their wealth in estates and properties across the provinces, after some of them had already accumulated hundreds of thousands in wealth. Undoubtedly his intentions were benevolent. He sought to be kind and generous to the Muslims, particularly to their eminent figures. However, this policy created a grave danger, one that had not escaped the keen insight of Abu Bakr or that of Umar after him. It led to the emergence of significant financial and social disparities within the Muslim community. It gave rise to a class of people who received wealth from every direction without toil or labour. Thus, luxury and extravagance began to take root, phenomena which Islam had explicitly denounced in its texts and teachings, and which the two caliphs before Uthman had striven to prevent. At this juncture, the Islamic conscience stirred within the hearts of some Muslims, most fervently embodied by Abu Dar. This noble companion, aflame with righteous indignation, stood as the voice of protest against these developments. Yet, in the more recent era, the Egyptian Fatwa Committee found no other recourse than to declare him mistaken in his stance, implying, astonishingly, that their own understanding of religion surpassed his. And then, in another instance, when circumstances shifted, they reversed their position and issued a ruling affirming the correctness of his views, as though the religion of God were a mere commodity to be traded in the marketplace of desires. Abu Dar rose to denounce the indulgence of the affluent, a luxury unknown to Islam. He rebuked Muawiyah and the Umayyads in particular for a policy that not only tolerated this extravagance, but encouraged it and wallowed in it. He also condemned Uthman himself for bestowing hundreds and thousands from the public treasury, thereby increasing the wealth of the rich and the luxury of the indulgent. Uthman granted Marwan ibn al-Hakam 1/5 of the revenue from North Africa, gave al-Harith ibn al-Hakam 200,000 dirhams, and awarded Zayd ibn Thabit 100,000. None of this could sit well with the conscience of Abu Dar. He went out to address the people. Indeed, there have come about deeds that I do not recognize. By God, they are neither in the book of God nor in the sunnah of his prophet. By God, I see truth being extinguished and falsehood coming to life. I see the truthful belied and wealth unfairly hoarded without piety. O assembly of the wealthy, bring equity to the poor, and give glad tidings to those who hoard gold and silver, and do not spend it in the way of God, of a torment of fire wherein their foreheads, their sides, and their backs shall be branded. O hoarder of wealth, know that there are 3 partners in your possessions: fate, which does not seek your permission before it takes away either its good or its evil through destruction or death; the heir, who waits for you to perish so he may seize it while you are despised; and you yourself, if you can avoid being the weakest of the 3, then do so. For God, the Almighty, has said, "You will not attain righteousness until you spend from that which you love." 3:92. You have taken to silk curtains and brocaded cushions, and you find discomfort in reclining upon coarse wool, while the messenger of God would sleep upon a simple mat. You have relished diverse foods, while the messenger of God never filled his belly with barley bread. Malik ibn Abdallah al-Ziyadi narrated from Abu Dar. He came seeking permission to enter upon Uthman ibn Affan, and he was granted entry while holding his staff. Uthman said, "O Ka'b, Abd al-Rahman has passed away and left behind wealth. What do you say concerning it?" Ka'b replied, "If he has fulfilled God's due in it, then there is no blame upon him." At this, Abu Dar raised his staff and struck Ka'b, declaring, "I heard the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, say, I would not wish to have this mountain turned into gold and to spend it all, only for it to be accepted from me, and yet leave behind 6 ounces of it. I adjure you by God, O Uthman, did you not hear this?" He repeated it 3 times, and Uthman answered, "Yes, I did." Such a call was intolerable to Muawiyah and Marwan ibn al-Hakam. They persisted in inciting Uthman against him until his fate was exiled to al-Rabada, banished from the land not for waging war against God and his messenger, nor for spreading corruption upon the earth, as the law of Islam requires for such punishment. It was a cry of conscience, a Muslim conscience untainted by greed, raised against an obscene accumulation of wealth that was fragmenting the Muslim community into social classes and undermining the very foundations that this religion was meant to establish among mankind. It suffices us to present here a single example of the immense fortunes amassed, as recorded by al-Masudi. During the time of Uthman, the companions acquired vast estates and great wealth. When Uthman was killed, his treasurer held 150,000 dinars and 1,000,000 dirhams in his treasury, while the value of his estates in Wadi al-Qura, Hunain, and elsewhere amounted to 100,000 dinars. He left behind countless camels and horses. The value of al-Zubayr's estate after his death reached 50 million dinars, and he left behind 1,000 horses and 1,000 slaves. The daily revenue of Talha's lands in Iraq was 1,000 dinars, and from the region of al-Sarrah, even more than that. At the time of his death, Abd al-Rahman ibn Auf had 1,000 horses, 1,000 camels, and 10,000 sheep, and the quarter of his estate that was distributed after his passing amounted to 84,000 dinars. Zayd ibn Thabit left behind so much gold and silver that it had to be broken with axes, apart from his other properties and estates. Al-Zubayr built a palace in Basra, and he also built in Egypt, Kufa, and Alexandria. Likewise, Talha built a palace in Kufa and another in Medina, which he constructed with plaster, baked bricks, and teakwood. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas built a palace in Al-Aqiq, raising its walls high and expanding its courtyards, crowning its top with parapets. Al-Miqdad built a mansion in Medina, plastering both its interior and exterior. Ya'la ibn Umayyah left behind 50,000 dinars, real estate, and other wealth valued at 300,000. This great wealth began modestly with the preferential treatment accorded to some Muslims over others in stipends during the era of distributive favour, which was intended to be abolished and its effects rectified had Umar not been struck down. That fateful dagger did not pierce Umar's heart alone, it pierced the very heart of Islam. Then wealth grew further under Uthman, who maintained these disparities in addition to granting lavish gifts, stipends and land grants. It then spread unchecked, with vast estates and properties amassed as a result of Uthman's policy of permitting the purchase of lands in the provinces and the enlargement of private holdings. And when a sincere, impassioned cry arose from the heart of Abu Dar, warning against these excesses, it found no attentive ear from the Caliph. Had it been heeded, it might have rectified the situation, fulfilling what Umar had intended in his final days to reclaim the surplus wealth of the rich and redistribute it among the poor, as was within the authority of the Imam, not merely as a right but as a duty to avert harm from the community and safeguard its collective welfare. And as wealth accumulated and swelled on one side, so too did poverty and destitution on the other, inevitably breeding resentment and fury. This mounting discontent soon congealed into a storm of sedition, exploited by the enemies of Islam, culminating in the tragic downfall of Uthman. With him fell the security and stability of the Muslim Ummah, plunging it into turmoil and upheaval that would not subside until its smoke had darkened the very spirit of Islam, ultimately delivering the community into the grip of dynastic rule. Thus it was no surprise that the wealthy and those who benefited from disparities in stipends opposed Ali's policy of justice and equality after Uthman's death. They feigned concern, urging him to abandon this course, warning him it would lead to rebellion. But his response was only to seek guidance from the pure essence of Islam within his unwavering conscience and declare, "Do you bid me to seek victory through injustice upon those whom I govern? If this wealth were my own, I would distribute it equally so. How then, when it is the wealth of God? Lo, to bestow wealth where it is undeserved is extravagance and waste. It may raise a man in this world, but it shall cast him down in the hereafter." As for the Banu Umayyah, they followed another course entirely in their dealings with wealth, until at last Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz arose and did what we have recounted, restoring what had been unjustly taken, ceasing the reckless scattering of the Muslims' wealth, and ensuring that the Banu Umayyah held no privilege over others. No flatterers or sycophants found a share in public funds, and the time of poets who sang the praises of rulers for gold came to an end. In a certain account it is related that Jarir once praised Umar, whereupon Umar said to him, "O son of the poet Al-Katafi, are you among the sons of the Muhajirun, that we may acknowledge your right among them? Or are you among the sons of the Ansar, that you may be entitled to what they are entitled to? Or are you among the poor Muslims, so that we may command the collector of your people's alms to grant you what is granted to them?" Jarir replied, "O Commander of the Faithful, I am neither one of these, nor am I in need, for I am among the wealthiest of my people and among those best in fortune. However, I ask of you what the caliphs have accustomed me to receiving, 4,000 dirhams, along with the customary provision of garments and mounts." Umar responded, "Every man shall meet the consequence of his deeds. As for me, I see no rightful claim for you upon the wealth of God, but wait until my allowance is dispersed. Then I shall see what suffices my family for the year and set it aside for them. If there remains any surplus, I shall offer it to you." Jarir replied, "Nay, let the Commander of the Faithful preserve his wealth and be praised for it, and I shall depart content." Umar said, "That is dearer to me." Thus Jarir departed, satisfied with Umar's response. However, after he had left, Umar reflected and said, "Indeed, this man conceals within him a certain trepidation. Bring him back to me." So they brought him back, and Umar said, "I possess 40 dinars and 2 cloaks. When one is washed, I wear the other. I shall divide this with you, provided that God, the Almighty and Majestic, knows that I am in greater need of it than you are." Jarir replied, "God has indeed provided for you, O Commander of the Faithful, and by God I am content." Umar then said, "Since you have sworn, know that what I withhold from myself without constraining my livelihood is of greater worth to me than any praise. Go then in peace." It is no wonder then that when the wealth of the Muslim community was safeguarded and distributed among its rightful claimants, the chroniclers recorded that the people under Umar ibn Abdul Aziz reached such a state of sufficiency that in some regions alms could not even find recipients, for the general prosperity of the people had rendered them independent of charity. In this regard, Yahya ibn Sa'id recounted, "Umar ibn Abdul Aziz appointed me to collect the alms tax from the lands of Ifriqiya. I gathered it and then sought out the poor to distribute it among them, but I found none in need. There was no one willing to take it from me, for Umar ibn Abdul Aziz had enriched the people, so I used these funds to purchase slaves and then set them free." Indeed, poverty and destitution are but the bitter fruits of unchecked accumulation and excess. The poor in every age are the casualties of the extravagance of the wealthy, and more often than not, the excessively wealthy are the offspring of favoritism, land grants, unjust privileges, and exploitation. During the era of the Umayyads, and later under the Abbasids, the treasury of the Muslim community became the personal reservoir of the rulers, as though it was their private estate. This was despite the existence of two distinct treasuries: the public treasury, whose revenues and expenditures were meant for the collective welfare of the people, and the private treasury, whose resources were supposedly designated for the ruler's personal expenses. Yet, history reveals that public funds were at times transferred into the private treasury, while private expenses were drawn from public wealth. In the Islamic civilization in the 4th century of the Hijra, Adam Metz writes, as translated by Muhammad Abdul Hadi Abu Rida, all grants and expenditures related to the caliphal court were drawn from the public treasury. We have records dating back to the early 4th century, detailing the revenues that were funneled into the private treasury. Among these were 1. Various inheritances left by fathers for their sons that were placed in the treasury. It is said that Caliph Harun al-Rashid left behind the largest sum, 48 million dinars. The Caliph al-Mu'tadid, 279-289 AH, was able to set aside, after annual expenditures, 1 million dinars each year, amassing a reserve of 9 million dinars. He aspired to round this off to 10 million, intending to melt it into a single ingot and make a vow that upon reaching this sum he would waive 1/3 of the annual tax burden upon the people. He intended to display this ingot at the public gate, so that those in the farthest reaches of the empire would hear that he possessed 10 million dinars and yet had no need for them. But death seized him before he could fulfill his ambition. His successor, al-Muqtafi, 289-295 AH, increased these reserves to 14 million dinars. 2. The revenues from the taxation of agricultural lands in Fars and Kerman, after deducting operational expenses. From 299 AH to 320 AH, 911-932 CE, these lands generated 23 million dirhams annually, of which 19 million dirhams were diverted to the private treasury. 3. The tax revenues from Egypt and Syria, the poll tax imposed upon non-Muslim subjects instead of being used for public welfare, was funneled into the caliph's private treasury, as if it were his personal entitlement. 4. Confiscated wealth from deposed ministers, scribes and officials, along with the revenues from their estates and the fortunes left behind by those who died without heirs. 5. Land revenues from the Sawad region, Ahwaz, and the eastern and western provinces, which were appropriated into the private treasury. 6. The annual surplus collected by the caliphs. In the late 3rd century, al-Mu'tadid and al-Muqtafi each managed to accumulate 1 million dinars per year. Caliph al-Muqtadir intended to follow the same practice, aiming to amass 25 million dinars, half of what Harun al-Rashid had left behind. From this account, one can discern how many of those who bore the title of Caliph were, in reality, monarchs who seized the commonwealth of the Muslims. It becomes evident how far financial policies had strayed from the tenets of Islam, how wealth and luxury flourished on one side while destitution and suffering deepened on the other, and how the fabric of the Muslim society unravelled due to its deviation from the path of Islam and its disregard for Islamic principles. Yet despite all this, the historical reality of Islam managed to establish several fundamental principles in financial governance and successfully implemented many of its economic doctrines, even amid the setbacks it suffered at the hands of the Umayyads. Among these principles was the recognition that the poor held a greater right to public wealth than those who merely had precedence in Islam. In Musnad Ahmad ibn Hanbal, it is recorded that Bakr ibn Isa narrated from Abu Awana, who narrated from Al-Mughira, who narrated from Al-Shabi, who narrated from Adi ibn Hatim. I came to Umar ibn al-Khattab with a group of my people. He began allotting stipends of 2,000 dirhams to men from the Thai tribe, but overlooked me. I approached him, yet he turned away. I then faced him directly, but he continued to disregard me. Finally I said, "O Commander of the Faithful, do you not recognize me?" At this he laughed so heartily that he reclined upon his back, then said, "By God, I know you. You believed when others disbelieved, you advanced when others retreated, and you remained loyal when others betrayed. It was the charity of Thai that brightened the face of the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, and the faces of his companions when you brought it to him." Then he excused himself, saying, "I only allotted stipends to those whose tribes were impoverished, for they are the chiefs of their people, burdened with responsibilities." And this is from Umar, who gave precedence to those of early merit. In estimating grants, this has its value and its significance. For need is the foremost justification for entitlement in the Islamic society. It is a principle deeply imbued with meaning, signifying Islam's aversion to poverty and destitution, and its insistence on eradicating them before attending to any other consideration. Islam detests the accumulation of wealth in one corner, while deprivation festers in another. And in the pursuit of eliminating this imbalance, the Muslim ruler who implements the divine law has the discretion to manage public wealth. This principle was manifested in the historical reality of the Prophet when he distributed the spoils of Banu al-Nadir exclusively among the impoverished emigrants, save for 2 destitute men from among the helpers. By this, he sought to restore a measure of equilibrium to the nascent Islamic society at the first opportunity that presented itself. Then came the Quran, confirming this historical precedent, so that it may not merely circulate between the rich among you. 59:7. This precedent holds immense significance and weight. Thus, the Muslim ruler who enforces the divine law always possesses the right to allocate a portion of public wealth to the poor, thereby restoring balance to the Islamic community and actualizing Islam's desire that no disparities between social classes may endure beyond the bounds of this general equilibrium. It is in this spirit that the principle of a graduated tax, proportionate to one's means and incapacities, was established. When the jizya was levied upon the non-Muslims under Muslim rule, it was apportioned as follows. A. The wealthy were to pay 48 dirhams per head annually. B. Those of moderate means were to pay 24 dirhams. C. The working poor were to pay 12 dirhams. No jizya was to be taken from a pauper who lived on charity, nor from one incapable of labour, be he a feeble elder, an invalid, a lunatic, or a person suffering from a chronic affliction. Furthermore, the jizya was only to be imposed upon free, sane men. Therefore, no woman or child was subject to it, and when famine struck in the year of the ashes due to drought, Umar did not dispatch his tax collectors to extract zakah. Instead, he let the people be until the drought had passed. When prosperity returned, he sent his officials to collect from the capable twice, once for the year of famine and once for the present year. He exempted those in hardship and then commanded that one of the 2 shares be returned to the people while the other was brought to him. Another principle was upheld, the prohibition of seizing essential provisions in the fulfillment of taxes and the prohibition of collecting dues through coercion. Ali ibn Abi Talib instructed one of his officials, "When you arrive among them, Do not sell their winter or summer garments, nor their sustenance which they eat, nor their beasts of burden upon which they labour. Do not strike any of them with a single lash over a dirham, nor stand them up in humiliation for a dirham, nor sell any of their possessions for any amount of tax. We have only been commanded to take from them what is surplus to their needs. Thus the principle of a man's need standing alongside the principle of his effort was established. The Prophet apportioned a share of war booty to the unmarried and a double share to the married. This allocation signifies that need is as valid a justification for entitlement as exertion. The toil of the married man in battle is akin to that of the bachelor, but his needs are doubled thus, his share was doubled. Hence, need alone is a sufficient justification for ownership in Islam, a principle that holds profound value in the realm of social security. Moreover, Islam established a comprehensive system of social security for every destitute and incapacitated individual. Umar decreed a stipend of 100 dirhams for every newborn, which would increase to 200 dirhams upon reaching maturity and would continue to rise thereafter. He also allocated 100 dirhams for every foundling, along with a monthly allowance for its guardian, ensuring that its sustenance and nursing were covered by the public treasury. Upon reaching adulthood, the foundling was granted equal status with other children. This was the magnanimity of Umar, inspired by the magnanimity of Islam. The abandoned child bore no fault for the sins of its parents. We have already recounted how he ensured provision for a blind Jewish man and for lepers among the Christians. This was Islam's mercy, embodied in Umar not for Muslims alone, but for all people. It was a safeguard for society against the perils of need, incapacity and deprivation. Furthermore, Islam established the principle of, "From where did you acquire this?" ensuring that no ruler was beyond the scrutiny of the community regarding his wealth. The people had the right to determine whether what he possessed was lawfully his or belonged to the public treasury. Upholding this principle serves as a deterrent, making a ruler think twice before encroaching upon public wealth. Umar enforced this principle upon all his governors, and Ali upheld it with certain officials. And then there is the universal principle of zakah, which remained inviolate even in the darkest of times when rulers strayed far from the essence of the faith. None dared to deny it, neither in theory nor in practice, since the wars of apostasy in the early days of Abu Bakr's rule, until the modern era, when Western materialism took hold and abolished the last living principle of Islam. Moreover, Islam enshrined the principle of communal solidarity, making every inhabitant of a town legally accountable for any person who perished from hunger among them, liable to pay blood money as if they had killed him. This principle is further underscored by the right of the famished or the parched to seize food or water by force if their survival depends on it. If they kill in the process, they bear no liability, neither in blood nor in punishment. Islam also prohibited usury and mandated respite for the debtor in hardship. Usury remained forbidden until materialist civilization, through the influence of French law, legitimized it as a fundamental pillar of economic life, without any dire necessity compelling its acceptance, save for the erosion of moral integrity and the absence of a spirit of cooperation and benevolence. Islam, however, made these virtues the foundation of society and the cornerstone of human interaction. Beyond legislation, Islam fostered traditions of charity, mutual aid, and social solidarity. The recent past, witnessed by our fathers, not merely our forefathers in the rural Muslim world, bears testament to the impact of this Islamic spirit. Even now, remnants of it persist, despite the overwhelming tide of Western materialism. The countless endowments and trusts now misappropriated under various guises stand as monuments to the spirit of mercy, benevolence and social security that prevailed among generations of Muslims near and far before they were corrupted by soulless, unfeeling materialist civilization. So deep was this commitment to social welfare that it extended beyond humanity to the animal kingdom. Some endowments were dedicated to sheltering and protecting infirm animals from abandonment and starvation. This is Islam, in spite of the early deviations that marred its practical implementation, deviations in the understanding of governance and financial policy that had far-reaching consequences. This is Islam in its historical actuality. As for Islam in its eternal principles, it remains ever ready to fulfill the evolving needs of any society that builds itself upon its foundation and adopts its divine law. It meets these needs with comprehensiveness and balance, free from the erratic oscillations of human experiments and ideologies that swing between excess and neglect experiments that exact from humanity a heavy toll of suffering and sacrifice. We call for the resumption of Islamic life within an Islamic society, governed by the Islamic creed and worldview, just as it is governed by the Islamic law and system. And we are fully aware that Islamic life of this nature has long ceased to exist in all corners of the earth, and with it the very existence of Islam itself has come to a halt. We proclaim this stark truth openly despite the shock, alarm and disappointment it may cause to many who still cherish the desire to be Muslims. And we proclaim it thus at the very moment we are calling for the revival of Islamic life within an Islamic society governed by the Islamic creed and worldview, just as it is governed by the Islamic law and system. We do not see in acknowledging this truth, nor in proclaiming it, anything that should lead to despair or disillusionment regarding this call and this endeavour. On the contrary, we believe that openly stating this painful truth that Islamic life has long ceased to exist across the earth, and that consequently the very existence of Islam itself has ceased, is a necessity, an indispensable requirement of this call and of any attempt to reinstate Islamic life. It is a necessity that cannot be avoided, for it is an established certainty in this religion that it cannot exist in the conscience merely as a belief, nor in practical life merely as a faith, unless people bear witness that there is no deity but God, which means that sovereignty belongs to none but God. Sovereignty, as manifest in his decree and ordainment, just as it is manifest in his law and command, all of these being equal in their foundational role for faith, which cannot take root in the conscience except through them. Likewise, this religion cannot exist in practical life unless the creed is embodied in a tangible system of life, the religion wherein the law of God reigns supreme over all aspects of human existence, both in general and in detail. It is in this system that both ruler and ruled renounce the claim to lordship by way of claiming sovereignty, by refraining from legislating laws and systems of governance that are not derived from the divine law, whether explicitly stated where the text exists, or deduced through reasoned judgment within the framework of general principles where no explicit text is found in obedience to the divine command. If you dispute over anything, refer it back to God and the Messenger if you believe in God and the last day. 459. And we do not define the meaning of religion or the concept of Islam in this manner from our own reasoning. In such a grave matter, upon which rests the very definition of God's religion and upon which depends the judgment of whether Islam exists in the world today or not, and with it the re-evaluation of the claim of hundreds of millions of people that they are Muslims in such a matter, no human being has the right to issue a ruling that may break backs in both this world and the next. Rather, it is God glorified be he the Lord of this religion and the sovereign of this Islam, who defines the meaning of religion and the concept of Islam through unequivocal texts that allow for neither interpretation nor evasion. Judgment belongs to none but God. He has commanded that you worship none but him. This is the upright religion. 1240. And judge between them by what God has revealed, and do not follow their whims. And beware lest they turn you away from some of what God has revealed to you. 549. And whoever does not judge by what God has revealed, they are the wrongdoers. 545. But know by your Lord, they do not believe until they make you judge in what they dispute among themselves, then find within themselves no discomfort concerning your judgment, and submit in full submission. 465. O you who believe, obey God and obey the Messenger and those in authority among you. And if you dispute over anything, refer it back to God and the Messenger if you believe in God and the last day. That is best and most suitable for final determination. 459. All of these verses affirm a singular truth, that there is no Islam nor any faith without acknowledging God's absolute sovereignty alone, without referring to him in all disputes where no explicit text exists, For there is no room for opinion where the text is clear, nor any dispute. To rule by what he has revealed, excluding all else in all matters of life, and to accept this rule wholeheartedly, both inwardly and outwardly, this alone is the upright religion. This alone is the Islam that God has ordained for humanity. And when we survey the entire face of the earth today in the light of this divine definition of religion and Islam, we do not see this religion in existence. Its existence ceased the moment the last group of Muslims abandoned the exclusive sovereignty of God in human affairs, the day they ceased to rule by his law alone in all aspects of life. We must acknowledge this painful reality, proclaim it openly, and not fear the disappointment it may cause to many who cherish the desire to be Muslims. For they have the right to be certain. How is one truly a Muslim? The enemies of this religion have for many centuries and continue to this day exerted immense cunning and malicious efforts to exploit the reluctance of many who wish to be Muslims to face this bitter truth, to acknowledge it in the light. They prey upon their hesitation to declare that the existence of this religion has ceased since the last Muslim community abandoned the rule of God's law in its entirety, thus forsaking the exclusive sovereignty of God, or in other words, forsaking his divinity, for sovereignty is inextricably linked to divinity. These cunning, deceitful enemies exploit this reluctance to anesthetize the emotions of many across the world, those who wish to be Muslims, and deceive them into believing that they still are Muslims in reality. That Islam is fine, that people can be Muslims without being governed by the law of this religion indeed, even without believing in the sovereignty of God alone. That whoever claims sovereignty for himself has claimed divinity and thereby committed disbelief, exiting the fold of this religion. Such is the extent of their audacity and deceit that the Orientalist Wilfred Cantwell Smith wrote an entire book titled Islam in Modern History, the primary objective of which was to establish that the secularism of Turkey instituted by Ataturk was Islamic. Indeed, that it was the only successful Islamic movement in contemporary history, and that Muslims who wish to preserve Islam's existence should follow its model, as it is the only correct attempt. Such is the audacity of deception, and thus we must proclaim the opposing truth, even if many who wish to be Muslims fear to do so, those who hesitate to declare that the existence of this religion has ceased. We must do so in order to neutralize the cunning anesthetic by which the enemies of this religion seek to numb the conscience of the world and of this religion itself. And we should not fear the bitter disappointment that may arise from declaring this truth. For we are certain thereafter that the future belongs to this religion, that this cessation of its presence will not persist, nay, it shall not last long, and that the bubbles inflated by the Crusader and Zionist colonialism in this land shall burst, as bubbles always do, no matter how grand in appearance or dazzling in brilliance. Indeed, this religion, which has temporarily ceased to exist in its full manifestation, is deeply rooted in this soil. It is embedded in the very nature of human existence. 12 centuries of its real and tangible presence in this world cannot be erased from this land. And the innate disposition upon which God has created mankind shall not be vanquished by the machinations of Crusader and Zionist colonialism. The future belongs to this religion in this land, where it once flourished in its fullest reality for over 1,200 years, and likewise in every other land where the innate nature of man still struggles against the ideologies, systems and laws imposed upon it. This is the present reality of this religion. Its existence is suspended, for it exists only in accordance with the meaning that God has ordained for it, which is that it must reign supreme, governing every aspect of human life alone. That through it, the divine sovereignty of God, exalted be he, shall be realized upon the earth, just as it is realized in the heavens. That his dominion shall be affirmed through submission to his law and his command, just as it is affirmed through his decree and his judgment, in confirmation of his words, and he it is who is God in the heavens and God on earth. Quran 43:84. And this is its future, a vast and unwavering hope in the return of this religion to existence, a hope sustained by its long history of presence, a hope affirmed by its innate primordial essence. Yet this vast and unwavering hope, must not render us complacent from examining the historical causes of this temporary cessation, from scrutinizing the obstacles that stand in the way of its actualization, and from considering the preliminary efforts required to pave the way for its return. We have already alluded to the tremor that shook the Muslim community in its early days of existence, a tremor caused by the deviation of the Umayyads from the pinnacle upon which the community had stood during the time of the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, and the era of the rightly guided caliphate. Now we shall briefly indicate the most significant shocks this religion endured thereafter, shocks which it withstood through the passing of centuries. The first of these was the rise of the Abbasid state, which relied upon elements that were newly entered into Islam, whose hearts had not yet been purified in devotion to it, for within them still surged the remnants of ancient tribal loyalties. And as time passed, the Abbasid state abandoned the very elements upon which it had been built, elements that had begun to merge into Islam, and turned instead to others whose hearts were veiled, the Turks, the Circassians, the Daylamites, and others. Thus the state continued to depend on forces that were at odds with the spirit of Islam, absorbing their influences due to its reliance upon them. Yet the spirit of Islam alone stood firm, resisting these elements and resisting even the power of the state itself, for it bore within it an inexhaustible energy and an immense vitality. Then came the devastating Mongol invasions, which swept over the Muslim world with a savage barbarism. Yet before long Islam had absorbed them into its current, engulfing them until they became but sediments within its vast stream. But not before it had shaken the Islamic spirit with a severe tremor, altering its conditions and customs. Nevertheless, the Islamic nation remained strong and cohesive despite the weakening of the state before the Mongol tempest, holding fast to the foundations of the faith, even if deviations emerged in certain official aspects. Here, we must recall that the Roman Empire, which took nearly 1,000 years to build and expand, disintegrated within a single century due to the invasions of the Huns and the Goths, leaving behind only scattered remnants and principalities. Whereas the Islamic State, which took barely a century and a half to establish, survived across vast territories despite internal strife among ruling families and external blows from the Mongols and others, a testimony to the immense vitality of Islam in facing such trials. As we continue tracing these shocks, we encounter the calamity of Al-Andalus in the west, following the Crusades in the east. In the former, Islam was defeated. In the latter, it triumphed. Yet, ever since that time, it has continued to endure the relentless enmity of the Crusader spirit, sometimes overt, sometimes concealed. But the catastrophe that utterly engulfed Islam came in this modern era, when Europe gained mastery over the world. The shadow of colonialism imbued with the Crusader spirit spread far and wide, covering the entire Muslim world, east and west. Every force at its disposal was mobilized to extinguish the Islamic spirit, driven by an inherited Crusader animosity, combined with the material and intellectual power it wielded, and further strengthened by the internal decline of the Muslim nation, a decline brought about by its gradual departure over long centuries from the teachings and guidance of its faith. When speaking of the latent Crusader hostility that still festers within the European psyche, we must not be deceived by appearances, nor beguiled by the pretense of respecting religious freedoms, nor lulled into believing that Europe today is less zealous for Christianity than it was during the Crusades, and thus has no reason to be fervently opposed to Islam as it once was. These are but deceptions and illusions. Was not Lord Allenby but an embodiment of Europe's collective conscience when he entered Jerusalem during the Great War and declared, "Today the Crusades are finally over"? Was not the Governor-General of Sudan but a representative of this same conscience when he placed every power of the government at the disposal of Christian missionaries in the south, forbidding any Muslim trader even from passing through? It was recorded that an official who had remained in the south for a long time requested a transfer to the north, but was denied. In the end, he resorted to a clever ruse. He raised his voice in the call to prayer, and that alone sufficed for his transfer to be ordered the very next morning. England is the most tolerant, forgiving and tactful of all European nations in dealing with matters of religion. Yet some may find it surprising that this spirit of intolerance towards Islam remains so deeply rooted in the European psyche, even after Europe has turned away from Christianity, no longer heeding the cries of pilgrims and saints, as it once did in the days of the Crusades. However, this astonishment fades when we turn our attention to two undeniable realities. The first reality: the evil that the Crusades unleashed was not confined to the clashing of swords. Rather, it was, above all else, a cultural evil. The poisoning of the European mind stemmed from the distortions that European leaders propagated about Islam and its lofty ideals, presenting them in a false light to the ignorant masses of the West. It was in that era that the absurd notion took root in European minds that Islam was merely a religion of rigid formalities, devoid of any spiritual purification or inner refinement. This misconception, once planted, remained firmly entrenched. It was also in that era that Prophet Muhammad was derided with the name Mahund, a grotesque distortion meant to evoke savagery and base desires. A comparison between Muhammad and Mahund reveals the malice behind this fabrication. Ma, a possessive pronoun, and hound derived from the Germanic hund, meaning dog. Those who coined this term played upon the similarity in sound to slander the name of the messenger of Islam. Thus the seeds of hatred were sown. The fanatical fervour of the Crusaders had far-reaching consequences across many parts of Europe, emboldening the Christians of Andalusia to wage war to rescue their lands from the heathen's yoke. The destruction of Muslim Spain, Al-Andalus, took centuries to accomplish, but as this protracted struggle ensued, hostility toward Islam in Europe took deeper root, becoming ever more entrenched. Its culmination was the utter eradication of Islam's presence in Spain, following a campaign of savage persecution so brutal, so merciless, that the world had never before witnessed its like. Yet, despite the unparalleled cruelty of this conquest, Europe broke into joyous celebration, oblivious to the fact that the aftermath of this triumph would bring about the demise of science, culture and learning, replacing them with the jahiliyyah and barbarism of the medieval age. The second reality. Before the echoes of these events had even faded in Spain, a third momentous occurrence further poisoned the relationship between the Western world and Islam: the fall of Constantinople into the hands of the Turks. To Europe, the Byzantine capital embodied the last vestiges of Greek and Roman grandeur, a bulwark defending Christendom from the so-called barbarians of Asia. With its fall, the gates of Europe were flung wide open to the advancing tide of Islam. In the centuries that followed, marked by incessant wars, Europe's enmity towards Islam was no longer merely a cultural matter, but had become a political necessity, intensifying the hostility that had long been brewing. Yet, for all the animosity, Europe benefited immensely from this tumultuous relationship. The Renaissance, or the revival of European arts and sciences so deeply indebted to Islamic, and in particular Arabic sources, was largely a result of the physical and intellectual encounters between East and West. Europe gained far more from Islam than Islam gained from Europe, yet it never acknowledged this debt. Instead of tempering its animosity in gratitude, Europe's hatred only grew with the passage of time, becoming a reflex so ingrained that it turned into habit. This enmity permeated the popular consciousness to such an extent that the mere mention of the word Muslim conjured disdain. It found expression in proverbs and everyday speech, embedding itself in the hearts of men and women alike. Even more astonishing is the fact that this hostility survived through every era of cultural transformation. When the age of religious reformation dawned, splitting Europe into warring sects, every faction stood armed against the other, yet, in their mutual enmity, all were united in their hatred of Islam. Then came an age in which religious fervour waned, yet the hatred of Islam endured. A striking testament to this is the case of the French philosopher and poet Voltaire, one of the fiercest critics of Christianity and its church in the 18th century, who, despite his disdain for Christianity, harbored an equally intense and irrational hatred for Islam and its prophet. A few decades later, as Western scholars began studying foreign cultures with a semblance of sympathy, one might have expected that the traditional contempt for Islam would wane. Instead, it merely took on a subtler form, manifesting as an unspoken bias in scholarly discourse. Thus, the chasm that history had carved between Europe and the Muslim world remained unbridged. Over time, this disdain became an essential component of European thought. The early Orientalists of the modern era were, for the most part, Christian missionaries operating in Muslim lands. The distorted image of Islam that they crafted was meticulously designed to reinforce European prejudices against what they saw as a religion of idolaters. Even after Orientalist studies freed themselves from the grip of missionary zeal, they could not rid themselves of the intellectual bias inherited from that legacy. This ingrained prejudice is a vestige of the Crusades, a subconscious remnant that continues to shape the European mind. A lingering legacy. Some may ask, how is it possible that such an ancient aversion, once rooted in religious fervour and justified by the Church's spiritual authority, still persists in an era where religious sentiment has all but faded into the past? There is nothing puzzling about this at all. It is well known in psychology that a person may outgrow all the religious beliefs instilled in childhood, yet still cling to certain superstitions associated with those abandoned doctrines, superstitions that defy all rational explanation. This precisely is Europe's condition with regard to Islam. Though the religious fervour that once fuelled its hostility has long since waned, replaced by a worldview steeped in materialism, the ancient aversion to Islam remains deeply embedded in the subconscious. Its intensity may vary from person to person, but its presence is undeniable. The spirit of the Crusades, albeit in a diminished form, still roams the corridors of Europe. Its civilization continues to regard the Islamic world with an attitude that bears unmistakable traces of that bygone spectre, still locked in its eternal struggle. And the second reality is this: that European and American colonialism, steeped as it is in the Crusader spirit, can never afford to ignore the fact that the Islamic spirit remains a rock of resistance against the tide of imperialism. This rock must either be shattered or at least displaced. No heed should be paid to the deceived or the paid agents who claim that Europe has no concern for religion, sees in it no source of strength, and fears nothing from the Muslim world except its material power. For in truth, religion is a force spiritual, yes, but also one that renews material strength. And Islam, unlike Christianity, does not preach passivity, but commands the preparation of tangible power, enjoins resistance and struggle, and warns those who surrender themselves in weakness of an ill fate, both in this world and the hereafter, and prepare against them whatever force you can muster, and steeds of war, to terrify thereby the enemy of God and your enemy. 8:60. O you who believe, do not take the disbelievers as allies instead of the believers. 4:144. Let those who sell the life of this world for the hereafter fight in the cause of God. 4:74. Do not falter nor grieve, for you shall be superior if you are true believers. If a wound has touched you, a similar wound has touched the enemy. 3:139, 140. Thus, religion is both a spiritual and an organizational force, a call to material power, a rock of resistance, and an exhortation to fierce defiance. It is inevitable, therefore, that European and American colonialism must stand as an enemy to this faith. The only difference lies in the manner of its hostility, which varies according to each nation's methods of imperialism and the prevailing circumstances. France, for instance, wages an open and declared war against Islam throughout the Maghreb under the guise of the Berber decree or any other pretext. Its representatives in Damascus openly proclaim themselves to be the heirs of the Crusaders. England, on the other hand, employs subterfuge, infiltrating Egypt's educational institutions to instill a mentality that despises all elements of Islamic and even Eastern life. Once it has shaped a generation of teachers imbued with this mindset, it unleashes them into schools and ministries of education to mould successive generations in the same image. These teachers design curricula and strategies that lead to this very outcome, systematically excluding from positions of influence those who represent Islamic thought and culture. In this way, England avoids direct confrontation with religious sentiment, leaving the task to a vast and influential cadre shaping the general consciousness of the Egyptian people. But in southern Sudan, England finds no need for such subtlety. There, it aligns itself openly with Christian missionaries against Muslim traders. America, meanwhile, establishes systems and regimes that crush Islam in its entirety, its doctrinal, moral, and dynamic aspects throughout the Muslim world. Thus, every colonial power has followed its own method in combating and suffocating this faith for centuries, and they continue to do so in a spirit of cooperation. This shared strategy is evident in the stance of Western nations on any issue that involves Islam, whether closely or remotely. Those who believe that the financial influence of the Jews in the United States and elsewhere is what directs Western policies. Those who attribute these policies to British ambitions and Anglo-Saxon cunning. Those who think that the conflict between the Eastern and Western blocs is the decisive factor. Such people overlook a fundamental element in this equation. Beyond all these factors, there exists the crusader spirit that runs in the blood of the Western peoples, a subconscious force that permeates their minds. Added to this is the colonial fear of the Islamic spirit and the relentless endeavour to dismantle its power, a common motivation that binds together communist Russia and capitalist America alike. Nor should we forget the role of global Zionism in plotting against Islam, rallying forces against it, both in the crusader colonial world and in the materialist communist world. This is but a continuation of the role that the Jews have played since the Prophet's migration to Medina and the establishment of the Islamic State. And yet, despite all these relentless assaults that Islam has endured since its earliest days, despite the battering it has suffered and the wounds inflicted upon its nascent body, despite the overwhelming dominance of Western civilization today, with its material and intellectual might, which has turned some who bear Muslim names into instruments of destruction against Islam in the hands of the imperialists, all while they remain oblivious despite all this, Islam itself has remained intact. Its latent energy continues to shape the course of human history, influencing global politics and strategies for 14 centuries until this very day. There has not been a single political or military movement in the world that has not, in some way, taken Islam into account even during its periods of weakness, division, and the erosion of its spiritual, social, and economic foundations. But the era of stagnation and decline has now passed. The tide of Islam is once again rising, visible in countless places, despite the crushing blows dealt to the pioneers of Islamic resurgence everywhere. These undeniable signs attest to the enduring vitality of Islam and to the fact that its stored potential is sufficient to rekindle an Islamic way of life, one that is not merely an aspiration or an optimistic dream, but a tangible, practical reality. Though obstacles and setbacks may sometimes appear, they are but fleeting bubbles like a summer cloud that soon dissipates. And yet, despite my unwavering belief in the inevitability of Islam's resurgence and its readiness to serve as a global system, not merely a local one in the future, I do not wish to be carried away by reckless fantasy. I cannot claim that this revival will be easy and effortless. On the contrary, formidable obstacles must be overcome, and monumental efforts must be undertaken before the restoration of true Islamic life can become a reality within Muslim societies. Recognizing these immense challenges and calling attention to the necessary tasks is an obligation dictated by an awareness of the grandeur of the goal and the weight of the responsibility that falls upon those who rise to meet it. It is not enough for a man to raise his voice in a thunderous cry brimming with fervour to make hope a reality and turn longing into truth. If he does not fully grasp the magnitude of the difficulties and responsibilities ahead, if he does not awaken those to whom he calls with a clear understanding of the immense effort required, then his cry will be in vain. Naturally, the prolonged separation between governance and the spirit of Islam makes the return to an Islamic political system all the more arduous. The apparatus of the state, the structure of society, the very foundations of life with all their elements, and the psychological and intellectual orientation of the people, all these have been built upon certain principles that are not easily overturned without immense and sustained effort. And the longer this separation endures, the greater the difficulty becomes, demanding even greater and more prolonged exertion. Then to the factor of the long passage of time, another present factor is added, that we do not live in this world alone, nor do we dwell in isolation from it. The intertwining of our interests and affairs with this world, dominated as it is by a particular civilization with a mindset utterly opposed to that of Islam, as we shall see later, renders our steps toward resuming a true Islamic way of life slow on the one hand and costly to us on the other. What amplifies the significance of this latter factor is that the Western world with which our interests are entangled is at present stronger than us. We hold neither dominion over it nor possess a power equivalent to its might, as we did in the early days of Islam. Moreover, it is in truth our adversary and adversary to our faith in particular. Thus, it will not allow us to establish an Islamic order anew, nor to resume a genuine Islamic existence, unless we exert manifold efforts that could have been lessened had we wielded control over the Western world, or had our strength matched its own, or had it been a friend to us and to the faith to which we seek to return. Yet none of this means that the return to the Islamic order is impossible. All it signifies is that it is an arduous and immense endeavour, one that demands extraordinary efforts, and above all, fervent faith in its necessity, courage in surmounting the obstacles arrayed in its path, patience in bearing the arduous toil it requires, and a firm conviction in its indispensability not only for the Muslim world, but for all of humanity. It calls for an inventive and constructive mentality, one whose task is not merely to patch up the existing reality, but to forge an entirely new and complete reality. And perhaps of great worth in this regard is to recall that the present Western civilization has led the world into two devastating wars within a span of merely a quarter of a century, that after the Second War it has driven the world into a division between the Eastern and Western blocs, into a perpetual threat of a third war, into turmoil in every corner of the globe, and into hunger, destitution and misery for 3/4 of the Earth's inhabitants. The global order as it stands today is in a state of disarray and upheaval, seeking new foundations and yearning for a spiritual sustenance that might restore humanity's trust in the principles of human dignity. Yet, with all this, we should not be overly swayed by the Western world's readiness to embrace the foundations of our Islamic civilization, for that is another matter entirely. Yes, a man like Bernard Shaw declares that the Western world has begun to lean in this direction, and he even predicts that it is on its way toward it, saying, "I have prophesied that the religion of Muhammad will be acceptable to Europe tomorrow, and indeed it has already begun to be accepted today." The clergy of the Middle Ages sought to portray Islam in the darkest hues, either out of ignorance or out of vile bigotry. In truth, they were consumed with hatred for Muhammad and his religion, seeing him as an adversary to Christ. But I deem it a duty to acknowledge Muhammad as the saviour of humanity. I believe that a man like him, if given leadership over the modern world, would succeed in solving its problems, bringing to it peace and happiness, how desperately the world is in need of both. Fair-minded thinkers of the 19th century recognized the intrinsic worth of Muhammad's religion. Among them were Carlyle, Goethe, and Gibbon. Thus, a positive transformation occurred in Europe's stance toward Islam, and in this century the 20th Europe has progressed further, beginning to develop an admiration for Muhammad's creed. Perhaps in the coming century it will go even beyond that and come to recognize the efficacy of this creed in solving its own dilemmas. Indeed, many among my people and the people of Europe have already embraced Muhammad's religion. This allows us to say that Europe's transformation toward Islam has begun. However, we view Bernard Shaw's prophecy as nothing more than a prophecy, if not indeed as a sedative meant to lull Muslims into complacency, reassuring them while they passively await Europe's conversion to their faith. At any rate, anticipating its fulfillment is at least premature, due to two principal reasons. First, the deeply ingrained historical hostility toward Islam that lies in the depths of European and American consciousness, an enmity that, in the modern era, is further fueled by the clash between Western and Eastern colonialist interests and the existence of Islam as an obstacle in their path. Second, the European mindset has been fundamentally shaped upon materialistic foundations, with but a faint imprint of spiritual thought, a legacy that has endured from the Roman civilization to the present age. This assertion requires further elaboration, for its significance extends beyond its relevance to the issue at hand. It also addresses a critical question: can Islamic civilization and Western civilization cooperate? And if so, what are the limits of such cooperation? At the outset of this book, we stated that Europe has never truly been Christian. This is because the nature of its continuous struggles over a small and meagre stretch of land prevented the compassionate principles of Christianity from taking deep root in its unwilling soil. This is in addition to Christianity's inherent asceticism and disregard for worldly affairs. To these two factors, we now add a third one to which we previously alluded only in passing: the presence of the ancient Roman Empire in the path of Christianity and the persistence of its doctrines as the foundation of modern European civilization, despite the subsequent adoption of Christianity. Christianity remained merely on the periphery of life. Here we may excerpt passages from Islam at the crossroads which suffices to illustrate this point. The idea upon which the Roman Empire was built was conquest by force and the exploitation of other peoples for the exclusive benefit of the homeland. To provide luxury for a privileged class, the Romans saw neither wrong in their brutality nor degradation in their oppression. The famed Roman justice was, in truth, justice only for the Romans themselves. Clearly, such an orientation could only arise from a purely materialistic conception of life and civilization, a materialistic outlook refined, no doubt, by an intellectual taste, yet ultimately devoid of all spiritual values. The Romans, in reality, knew no true religion. Their traditional deities were but pale imitations of Greek mythologies, mere phantoms whose existence was acknowledged only as a matter of social convention. They were never permitted to intervene in the affairs of real life. Rather, they were expected to utter prophecies through the lips of their soothsayers when asked, but never to bestow upon humankind any moral laws. That was the soil in which modern Western civilization took root. Undoubtedly, many other influences played a role in its development, and naturally, it has modified and reshaped the cultural heritage it inherited from Rome in more than one aspect. Yet the enduring truth remains that all that is genuine in the Western outlook on life and morality today traces its origins to Roman civilization. Just as the intellectual and social climate of ancient Rome was purely utilitarian and devoid of any religious essence, not merely as an assumption, but as an undeniable reality, so too is the intellectual atmosphere of the modern West. Without possessing any conclusive proof against the absolute truth of religion, and without even feeling the necessity for such proof, modern European thought, while occasionally tolerating religion and at times even affirming it as a social convention, generally excludes absolute morality from the realm of practical considerations. Western civilization does not deny God outright, but it sees no place for him, nor any utility in him within its current intellectual framework. It has fashioned a virtue out of man's intellectual incapacity, his inability to encompass the totality of existence. Thus, the modern European mind tends to ascribe practical significance only to those ideas that fall within the scope of empirical sciences, or, at the very least, to those that can be expected to influence human relationships in a tangible manner. Since the question of God's existence falls under neither category, the European intellect instinctively tends to dismiss God from the sphere of practical considerations. Here arises a question: how can this tendency be reconciled with the Christian mode of thought? Is not Christianity presumed to be the spiritual foundation of Western civilization, a creed built upon absolute morality, just as Islam is? Undoubtedly it is. But herein lies one of the gravest misconceptions: to regard modern Western civilization as the natural outcome of Christianity. The true intellectual foundations of the West must be sought in the Roman conception of life as a matter of pure utility, entirely devoid of any absolute vision beyond immediate material concerns. This mentality can be articulated as follows. Since we possess no definite knowledge through empirical investigation and mathematical calculation regarding the origin of human life or its destiny after the body perishes, it is best for us to confine our efforts to those aspects of existence that lie within our material and intellectual capabilities, without allowing ourselves to be bound by absolute moral values or ethical considerations based on claims that challenge scientific evidence. Thus, it is clear that this tendency, which characterizes modern Western civilization, is fundamentally incompatible with religious thought, not only within Christianity, but also within Islam and every other faith, because at its core it is irreligious. To attribute the achievements of modern Western civilization to Christianity is, therefore, a profound historical error. Christianity played only a minor role in fostering the material and scientific progress by which the West, in its present civilization, has surpassed all others. In truth, this progress emerged from Europe's long struggle against the Church and its particular vision of life. Today, for the vast majority, Christianity holds only a formal significance, much like the gods of ancient Rome, who were neither allowed nor expected to exert any real influence over society. Certainly, there still exist in the West many individuals who think and feel in a religious manner, striving often in vain to reconcile their beliefs with the spirit of their civilization. Yet these are exceptions. The average European, whether Democrat, fascist or Bolshevik, whether labourer or intellectual, acknowledges only one positive religion, the worship of material progress. That is, the belief that life has no higher purpose beyond making itself ever more comfortable, or, as it is commonly expressed, liberating it from the tyranny of nature. The temples of this religion are the colossal factories, the cinemas, the chemical laboratories, the dance halls and the power stations. Its priests are the financiers, the engineers, the film stars, the industrial magnates and the aviation heroes. The inevitable consequence of this state of affairs is an incessant striving for power and pleasure, leading to societies armed to the teeth, locked in ceaseless conflict, each determined to enrich itself at the expense of others whenever their opposing interests collide. On the cultural plane, this results in the creation of a human type whose moral philosophy is confined to considerations of practical utility, for whom the highest distinction between good and evil is nothing more than material progress. The essence of all this is that the present European conscience is not yet prepared to perceive the spirit of Islam and to seek its guidance in solving humanity's problems. Yet this is not an impossibility, though it may require several upheavals and further developments until the Muslim world itself embarks upon a clear and independent Islamic way of life, founded upon its own principles. Only then will the realistic minds of the West encounter tangible facts that appeal to their sense of reason and gradually reshape their thinking. However, my personal belief is that generations upon generations will pass before the West can truly sense the spirit of Islam in any meaningful way. Likewise, the essence of all this is that the Islamic mode of thought rooted in moral objectives can find common ground with the present Western mode of thought, which bases morality on utilitarian ends. This is something we must carefully consider in our endeavour to establish a sound Islamic life, lest we attempt to patch it with borrowed elements from the outside. For such patches will never harmonise with the authentic fabric of our intellectual heritage. Those who urge the advocates of Islam to adopt Western intellectual methodologies concede to defeat from the very first round. They seek to revive their lives by borrowing Western modes of thought, conduct and existence, only to end up burying the very life they sought to restore. For from the very first step, they deviate from the natural and singular path. To think upon Islamic foundations that render the moral element intrinsic to life's structure, viewing ethical objectives as the ultimate purpose of action, rather than mere instruments of higher utility. We have already seen in the opening chapters of this book that Islam fulfills all the noble aims of life while safeguarding the moral dimension within them. Its greatest dynamic value lies in the fact that it does not fragment life, nor does it separate means from ends. It does not presume a conflict between the material and the spiritual in the fabric of existence, nor in the nature of the universe and mankind. Rather, it assumes that life is a unified whole, moving entirely toward these objectives in harmony and congruence. Thus, Islam presents humanity with a comprehensive idea of life, an idea that remains ever open to growth in its branches and applications, yet is not subject to alteration or fusion in its essence or direction. In order for this comprehensive idea to yield its natural and complete results, it must be applied in its entirety. Any modification of its foundations or deviation from its course disrupts its balance, preventing the realization of the life Islam envisions. However, perpetual growth in its branches and applications, anchored in its fundamental conception, is a natural process sanctioned and encouraged by Islam itself. Islam provides the means for such evolution through the continuous practice of ijtihad, independent reasoning, and the broad authority granted to the Imam who governs by divine law. These are living instruments that ensure the ongoing expansion of Islamic applications to keep pace with the movement of life and to meet its ever-renewing needs. There is only one condition that must be upheld. These developments and applications must not depart from Islam's fundamental principles, nor should they take a direction contrary to its path, nor should they cunningly adopt a foreign essence disguised in Islamic garb. When a truly Muslim society emerges, the door will remain open for ijtihad and for the application of Islamic laws within this society. The criterion for accepting or rejecting any new development will be its alignment with Islam's fundamental conception and overarching spirit. That which conforms to Islam's essence, we shall accept. That which contradicts it, we shall reject. And we must hold fast to this with a faith and fervour beyond mere conviction, for we possess a vision of life far superior to that of the followers of any other religion, philosophy, or civilization. For it is fashioned by God, the creator of life itself. Yet this is but a broad assertion that requires a detailed exposition of the practical means by which this great goal can be attained. So, with God's blessing, let us proceed to this exposition. The revival of an Islamic way of life cannot be achieved merely by enacting laws and regulations derived from the Sharia, for this is but one pillar of the two upon which Islam always rests in the establishment of life. And it is the second pillar, not the first. The first and foremost pillar is the true creed, Aqidah, that acknowledges God alone as the sole deity and consequently as the sole sovereign in legislation. It rejects any claim to divinity by those who usurp the right of sovereignty for themselves, whether by asserting their right to legislate or by exercising it in practice. Social justice is but a part of this comprehensive Islamic life, and it cannot be fully realized except through the establishment of that life itself. Nor can it be sustained unless it is founded upon its firm principles, just as any system must rest upon belief in its validity and confidence in its efficacy. Otherwise it loses its moral foundation and exists merely by means of legislative and administrative coercion, whose endurance is only as long as the ability to evade it remains absent. For this reason, Islamic legislation is more readily followed and obeyed as it is rooted in religious conviction. This is also why our starting point must be to revive this creed, purging it of the distortions, misinterpretations and doubts that have crept into it, so that it may serve as the pillar upon which the legal system we propose for an authentic Islamic life is built. Thus, when this life is established, it will be upheld through both legislation and guidance, the two fundamental instruments through which Islam achieves all its aims. Hence, we must rebuild Islamic faith upon the foundational principles we outlined earlier in this chapter, ingraining them within individuals and communities before we even begin to deliberate upon the Islamic legal system that will govern life. But how can we cultivate an Islamic creed using educational systems, cultural frameworks, and methods of upbringing that are, at their core, Western systems that, by their very nature, oppose the Islamic idea of life? Firstly, because they are fundamentally materialistic, antagonistic to Islam's vision of existence. And secondly, because the opposition to Islam is an inherent component of their formation, whether this opposition is overt or concealed within the folds of their discourse. As I have said before, we concede our defeat from the very first round if we adopt the Western intellectual framework as a means to revive the Islamic idea. Thus, we must first rid ourselves of the Western mode of thought. We must adopt an intrinsically Islamic way of thinking so that our intellectual output remains pure, untainted, and free from hybridity. The concept of hakimiyya, sovereignty, in the Islamic paradigm is not confined merely to the reception of divine legislation and adjudication by it. Therefore, servitude to God alone does not manifest solely in receiving his law and ruling by it. If we reduce Sharia to mere governance and legal statutes, then we would be misrepresenting its essence in the Islamic worldview. The divine law of God encompasses all that he has ordained for the regulation of human life. This is manifested in the foundations of belief, governance, conduct, and knowledge. It is reflected in creed and perception, along with all the premises that shape this perception. It is embodied in legislative rulings, in the principles of ethics and behavior, and in the values and measures that prevail in society, those by which individuals, objects, and events are weighed and assessed. Furthermore, it extends to knowledge in all its dimensions and to the principles governing intellectual and artistic endeavours in their entirety. In all of this, there must be an unquestioning reception from God, just as in legislative rulings without distinction. The matter of sovereignty, in its aspect related to governance and law, may now be understood after the explanations we have provided concerning it. Likewise, the necessity of referring to the Islamic conceptual framework and to what has been detailed in the Book of God and the Sunnah of his Messenger regarding rules of morality and conduct may be comprehensible. Similarly, the values and measures that prevail in society, determining the worth of individuals, objects and events, may also be understood to some extent. For the values that dominate a society stem directly from the prevailing perception of existence, from the relationships between existence and its creator, and from the relationships among the various components of existence. They also derive from the objectives and ultimate purposes that this perception identifies as the goals of that society, or as the ultimate purpose of human existence as a whole. By way of example, the ultimate purpose of human existence in the Islamic worldview is the worship of God, that is, servitude to him alone and liberation from servitude to any other than him. Man's function is that of stewardship on earth on behalf of God, to harness its resources, to analyze and synthesize, to cultivate life and advance it through material creativity within the framework of God's law and within its boundaries, so that man may elevate himself in material life, enjoying the adornments of God which he has brought forth for his servants and the good things of sustenance. 732. And so that he may rise in his spiritual life, liberated from material constraints. The standard of distinction in life, according to the Islamic perspective, is piety. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you. 49:13. Upon this foundation of piety rests the entire structure of Islamic ethics and all principles of conduct. For piety arises from the realization of God's divinity and man's servitude to him, and it engenders the sentiments upon which the entire edifice of ethics is built. We have spoken previously of these premises, yet we recall them now to emphasize that Islam has its own distinctive values derived from the very same source from which its creed is drawn. They do not originate from any other source, for they are a direct consequence of servitude to God's divinity alone. They are part of the meaning of God's law in its fullest sense, which is not confined to the commonly understood meaning of Sharia. Thus, the principles of belief and perception, the foundations of morality and conduct, and the values and measures that govern society in its entirety, these are not to be received by a Muslim from any source other than the divine source. In this reception lies the essence of faith itself. To receive them from any other source contradicts the fundamental acknowledgement of exclusive servitude to the one divine sovereignty, just as does the reception of legal rulings from sources other than God, regarding which we have already conveyed God's judgment. There are no separate ethics for an agricultural society and others for an industrial society, There are no values unique to agrarian communities and others exclusive to industrial ones. There are no ethics peculiar to the bourgeoisie and others to the proletariat. There are no values specific to capitalist societies and others to socialist ones. Rather, there exist only two categories: Islamic ethics and pre-Islamic, Jahili ethics, Islamic values and pre-Islamic values. There are values and ethics that spring from the perception of a single divinity and universal servitude to him, and there are values and ethics that originate from a multiplicity of deities in all their various manifestations, leading to the fragmentation of human conscience and the disintegration of human life between these competing lords. There are ethics and values that emerge from the Islamic conception of existence, its relationship with its creator, the position of man within it, his purpose and function, and the nature of his bonds with the material universe, with all living creatures, and with his fellow human beings. And there are ethics and values that arise from pre-Islamic conceptions in all their forms and manifestations. All conceptions that deviate from the Islamic one are pre-Islamic Jahili. In nature, they represent the divergent paths that never converge with the straight path of God, as he himself has defined it, rather than as shaped by human whims, and thus they can never lead to God. The entire structure of society, its social, political and economic systems, is but an extension of its foundational faith and a practical application of the values emerging from that faith. Therefore, in all these matters, the reception of guidance must come solely from the Islamic conception or from the divine law in its true meaning, which extends beyond the commonly understood definition of Sharia. To receive guidance in these aspects from the divine source alone is a fundamental requirement of acknowledging exclusive servitude to God's sovereignty. The matter here is no different from the issue of receiving legal rulings from sources other than God, an issue around which the conventional understanding of Sharia revolves, and upon which the prevalent notion of sovereignty is based. However, Sharia is far broader in scope, and sovereignty extends beyond this limited interpretation. This much may be somewhat understood, and for readers of such discourses it is neither novel nor unfamiliar. Yet it must be emphasized that in all such matters the issue at hand is one of faith itself. It pertains directly to the affirmation or denial of complete servitude to the one divine sovereignty. What may seem somewhat unfamiliar, however, is the notion that artistic, intellectual and scientific pursuits must also be referred back to the Islamic worldview and its divine source on the grounds that such endeavors are intimately tied to faith itself, and that their proper direction is a natural consequence of acknowledging exclusive servitude to the one divine sovereignty. In the realm of artistic expression, a comprehensive book has been dedicated to elucidating this issue, for artistic activity is a human expression of man's perceptions, emotions, responses and inclinations, all of which are governed, or rather shaped within the Muslim soul by its all-encompassing Islamic worldview. This worldview embraces every aspect of the cosmos, the self and life, along with their relationship to the creator of all existence. It presents a unique conception of man's reality, his position in the universe, the purpose of his existence, his function, and the values that define his life, all of which are embedded within the Islamic perception, which is not merely an intellectual construct, but a creed alive with unifying force, a dynamic, compelling, and all-encompassing influence that governs every stirring within the human soul. We shall address this matter briefly in the following passages of this chapter. However, the issue of intellectual and scientific activity and the necessity of referring these pursuits back to the Islamic worldview and its divine source as a fulfillment of the acknowledgement of exclusive servitude to the one and only God, that is, as a realization of the Muslims' Islam in terms of faith. This is a matter that may require a full exposition, for it may appear even to many readers of this age, including Muslims, who recognize the necessity of referring sovereignty and legislation back to God in order to affirm the essence of Islam and faith as something unfamiliar or unconsidered. A Muslim has no choice but to receive guidance in matters related to faith and the general perception of existence, in matters of worship, morality, values, and the standards by which society is governed. Likewise, in the fundamental principles of political, economic and social systems, and in the interpretation of the motives underlying human activity and the course of history, he must draw exclusively from the divine source. And he must receive such knowledge only from a fellow Muslim whose faith, piety and living practice of Islam inspire trust. Yet the Muslim is permitted to acquire knowledge in the pure sciences such as chemistry, physics, biology, astronomy, industry, agriculture, and the technical and administrative aspects of governance, as well as the methodologies of labor and warfare from both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. However, in an Islamic society, once it is properly established, there must be a concerted effort to cultivate expertise in all these fields, treating them as collective obligations, fard kifaya. That is, there must be individuals who specialize in them so that the burden is lifted from the rest. For if such expertise is not developed, then the entire community bears the sin of neglecting this duty. Moreover, it must provide an environment where such expertise can flourish, function, and yield results. Until such a reality is achieved, however, an individual Muslim may seek knowledge in these pure sciences and their practical applications from both Muslims and non-Muslims. He may also benefit from the efforts and contributions of both. Furthermore, he may employ both Muslims and non-Muslims in these fields, for they fall within the purview of the Prophet, saying, "You are more knowledgeable about your worldly affairs." Muslim 2363. Such pursuits do not influence the formation of a Muslim's perception regarding life, the universe and humanity, nor do they shape his understanding of the purpose of existence, his true function, or the nature of his relationships with the surrounding existence and with the Creator of all. They do not pertain to principles, laws, systems and structures that organize life at the individual and collective levels. Therefore, they pose no threat to the integrity of his faith, nor do they risk leading him back into the shadows of Jahiliyyah. However, when it comes to interpreting human activity, whether at the individual or societal level, this pertains to the understanding of man's very nature and the course of his history. Similarly, matters concerning the origins of the cosmos, life and humanity, particularly in relation to what lies beyond the physical realm, these are not the domain of the pure sciences such as chemistry, physics, astronomy, biology or medicine. Rather, they belong to the same category as legal rulings, fundamental principles and systems that govern human life and activity. Such matters are inherently linked to faith, and thus a Muslim must not seek guidance in them from anyone other than a fellow Muslim whose faith and piety are beyond question, and who is aware that all such knowledge must be received from God. It is essential that this understanding remains deeply rooted in the Muslim's consciousness, so that he perceives it as a matter directly connected to his faith. He must be fully aware that adhering to this principle is an intrinsic requirement of his servitude to God alone, in other words, a fundamental aspect of his Islam. A Muslim may study all forms of knowledge produced by non-Islamic civilizations, but not for the purpose of adopting their worldview in these matters. Rather, he studies them to recognize the deviations of ignorance, Jahiliyyah, and to understand how these human errors may be rectified by realigning them with the principles of the Islamic worldview. The trends in philosophy as a whole, the various interpretations of human history, the entire field of psychology, aside from certain empirical observations and recordings, detached from broader ideological interpretations, ethics, comparative religion, and the social sciences in their entirety, except for raw statistics and direct data without the general conclusions drawn from them, all of these disciplines, within the framework of non-Islamic thought, whether ancient or modern, are profoundly influenced by pre-Islamic Jahili conceptions. They are built upon such conceptions, and most of them, if not all, contain at their methodological core an overt or covert hostility toward religious conceptions in general, and particularly toward the Islamic worldview. The nature of these intellectual and scientific pursuits differs from the study of chemistry, physics, astronomy, biology, medicine, and the like, so long as these remain confined to empirical observation and the recording of factual results without venturing into philosophical interpretations of any kind. An example of such transgression is the case of Darwinism, which, instead of restricting itself to the observation and classification of biological phenomena, extended into philosophical claims without evidence and without necessity, merely out of desire and whim. It asserted, without any compelling reason, that there is no need to posit the existence of a force beyond the natural world to explain the emergence and evolution of life. The Muslim possesses in the clear guidance of his Lord an ample sufficiency concerning all these matters, rendering the endeavours of human thought in these fields feeble and laughable by comparison. Moreover, this entire affair is directly bound to faith itself, the faith in the one divinity and the all-encompassing servitude to him. This is the foundation of the Islamic worldview and its supreme truth. The notion that culture is a universal human heritage belonging to no nation, race or religion is correct only when applied to the pure sciences and their practical applications, so long as it does not extend beyond this domain into the philosophical interpretations of scientific results, nor into philosophical interpretations of man himself, his activities, his history, nor into art, literature, and all other forms of emotional expression. Beyond this, however, it becomes one of the traps of global Jewry, whose interest lies in dissolving all barriers, foremost among them the barriers of faith and creed, so that they may infiltrate the very fabric of the world while it lies in a state of drowsy stupor. Thus they engage in their satanic machinations, foremost among them their usurious enterprises, which ultimately lead to the entirety of human toil being funneled into the coffers of the Jewish financial institutions. But Islam distinguishes between two types of culture beyond the realm of pure sciences and their applications: Islamic culture, founded upon the principles of the Islamic worldview, and the culture of ignorance, Jahiliyyah, which, despite its various schools, ultimately rests upon a single foundation, the deification of human thought rather than submission to God's balance. Islamic culture is comprehensive, encompassing every field of intellectual and practical human endeavour. Within it are principles, methodologies, and characteristics that ensure its perpetual growth and vitality. It is well known that the empirical approach upon which modern European industrial civilization is built initially emerged in Islamic universities, deriving its foundations from the Islamic conception of the universe, its tangible reality, its hidden treasures, and its provisions. However, the European Renaissance then took this methodology, nurturing and refining it, while the Muslim world gradually abandoned it due to both internal stagnation and the external onslaught of Zionist and Crusader forces that sought to sever it from its creed, worldview, and fundamental methodology. Europe, in turn, severed the methodology it had borrowed from its Islamic roots, casting it far from God, an estrangement that coincided with its rebellion against the Church, which had wielded power over the people in tyranny and aggression under the guise of divine authority. Thus, the entirety of European intellectual output, like all intellectual products of Jahiliyyah across time and place, became something fundamentally different, in essence, from the components of the Islamic worldview. Consequently, the Muslim must return solely to the foundations of his own worldview, drawing only from the divine source whenever possible. And if he must take knowledge from another, let it be from a righteous Muslim whose faith and piety are well known, such that he may trust in learning from him. The claim that knowledge is independent of its source is a notion Islam does not recognize when it comes to any sciences that influence one's worldview, sciences that shape man's perception of existence, life, human activity, societal structures, values, traditions, and all other aspects of human existence. Islam permits a Muslim to acquire knowledge from non-Muslims, or even from non-pious Muslims, in fields like pure chemistry, physics, astronomy, medicine, industry, agriculture, administration, and clerical work, so long as he finds no righteous Muslim from whom to learn these sciences, as is our unfortunate reality today, a reality born of our estrangement from our faith, our methodology, and our understanding of the requirements of vicegerency upon the earth as ordained by God. And this vicegerency necessitates proficiency in these various sciences and skills. However, Islam does not permit a Muslim to derive the foundations of his creed, the components of his worldview, the interpretation of the Quran and Hadith, the biography of the Prophet, the methodology of Islamic history, the interpretation of its movements, the philosophy of its society, its system of governance, its political methodology, or the inspirations of its art and literature from non-Islamic sources. Nor does it allow him to take such knowledge from a non-Muslim unless he is certain of that person's faith and piety. The one putting forth these words is a man who has spent 40 years of his life reading, his primary occupation being reading and study, across most fields of human knowledge, both within his specialization and beyond, out of intellectual passion. And yet, when he returned to the sources of his faith and worldview, he found everything he had read before to be minuscule, insignificant when compared to the vast treasury of divine knowledge, a reality that could not have been otherwise. And though he does not regret the 40 years spent in study, he has come to know the true nature of Jahiliyyah, its deviation, its insignificance, its pettiness, its clamour and self-importance, its arrogance and empty pretensions. And he has come to know, with absolute certainty, that it is impossible for a Muslim to synthesize these two sources of knowledge. Thus, what has been stated here is not merely a personal opinion, it is far weightier than that, too grave in the sight of God to be left to mere conjecture. Rather, it is a matter to be judged by the words of God and the words of his messenger, peace and blessings be upon him. For in such matters the believers must refer back to God and his messenger whenever they differ, if indeed they believe in God and the last day. God Most High has spoken concerning the ultimate aim of the Jews and Christians regarding Muslims. Many among the people of the book wish to turn you back to disbelief after your faith, out of envy from their own selves, even after the truth has become clear to them. So forgive and overlook until God brings his command. Indeed, God has power over all things. 2:109. And never will the Jews or the Christians be pleased with you until you follow their way. Say, indeed, the guidance of God is the only guidance, and if you were to follow their desires after the knowledge that has come to you, you would have neither protector nor helper against God. 2:120. O you who have believed, if you obey a faction of those who were given the scripture, they will turn you back, after your belief, into disbelievers. 3:100. And when the ultimate objective of the Jews and Christians regarding Muslims is thus unequivocally established, it would be utter folly to assume even for a moment that they could offer anything beneficial or enlightening in matters pertaining to the Islamic creed, Islamic history, or the guidance of the Islamic society in governance, politics, or economy. Those who believe otherwise, despite the clear warnings of God, are indeed heedless. Likewise, from the words of God, say indeed, the guidance of God is the only guidance. 2:120. It is established that the sole source to which the Muslim must turn in these matters is the divine guidance itself. For beyond the guidance of God, there is only misguidance. No alternative path exists, as is made clear in the exclusivity of the Quranic formulation. Say, indeed, the guidance of God is the only guidance, a statement that leaves no room for doubt or alternative interpretation. And the divine command is categorical in turning away from those who shun the remembrance of God and concern themselves solely with worldly affairs. For such people possess only conjecture, and the Muslim is forbidden from following mere conjecture. Their knowledge is superficial, limited only to the outward aspects of worldly life, while they remain heedless of the hereafter. So turn away from him who turns away from our remembrance and desires nothing but the life of this world. That is the extent of their knowledge. Indeed, your Lord knows best who has strayed from his path, and he knows best who is rightly guided. 53:29-30. They know only the outward aspect of the life of this world, but of the hereafter they are heedless. 37. Thus, a man who is heedless of divine guidance and preoccupied only with the world, such as the so-called scholars of today, knows only the superficial. And this is not the kind of knowledge in which a Muslim should place his trust for matters of faith and worldview. And he who turns away from the guidance of God, desiring nothing but the life of this world for such, is the case of all the scholars of today, knows only the outward aspect of existence. Yet this is not the kind of knowledge in which a believer places his trust, nor the kind from which he may take guidance in all matters of life. At most, one may accept from such a person what pertains strictly to empirical knowledge confined to the material realm. But from him, one must not seek an interpretation of existence as a whole, nor the conceptual underpinnings of life and its meaning. For this is not the knowledge to which the Quranic verses refer, nor the kind upon which they bestow praise. Indeed, any knowledge that does not lead to guidance towards God, that does not stem from an awareness of his grace in teaching man what he knew not, 96:5, in bestowing upon him at the very outset the gift of perception and understanding, 16:78, in subjugating for him the forces of nature, 45:13. Any knowledge that does not rest upon these foundations is but a misleading and misguiding knowledge. It is not the knowledge which the Quran extols, nor the knowledge that it enjoins mankind to seek. Yet how often do people wrench Quranic verses from their proper context, invoking them in support of meanings alien to their true intent? Knowledge, by its very nature, is not confined to theology and religious obligations alone. Rather, it encompasses all things, extending to the natural laws and their harnessing for the stewardship of the earth, just as it pertains to faith and religious duties alike. Yet, knowledge that severs itself from its foundational connection to faith is not the knowledge that the Quran extols or whose bearers it praises. There exists an intrinsic link between faith and the sciences astronomy, biology, physics, chemistry, medicine, and all other disciplines concerned with the natural laws and the principles governing life. For all of them, when untainted by the whims of those who turn away from God, inevitably lead to him. But when these sciences are wielded by misguided desires to distance from God, as was the case with the European intellectual movement during its scientific renaissance, then they become a means of deviation. This unfortunate divergence had its origins in the grim historical circumstances of Europe, where the men of science found themselves at odds with the oppressive church. This conflict left a profound impact on all facets of European thought, shaping its intellectual methodologies and the very nature of its reasoning. It left behind toxic sediments of hostility, not merely towards the Church and its doctrines, but towards the very essence of religious thought itself. This enmity seeped into every field of European intellectual output, whether in metaphysical philosophy or in purely scientific inquiry, which on the surface appeared to be detached from religion. Once it is established that Western intellectual methodologies and their fruits in all fields of knowledge are fundamentally rooted in this deep-seated hostility towards religion in its entirety, it becomes evident that these methodologies are even more antagonistic towards the Islamic worldview in particular. This is no mere coincidence. Rather, it is an intentional, systematic effort, consciously undertaken in many instances to dissolve the Islamic creed, its conceptual foundations, and its unique worldview. It is a deliberate endeavour to dismantle the very pillars upon which the Muslim society's distinctiveness is built. Thus, it would be a grave folly to rely upon Western intellectual methodologies and their products in the study of Islam itself. Likewise, caution is imperative even in the study of the natural sciences fields in which, given our present circumstances, we have no choice but to receive knowledge from Western sources. We must be vigilant against the philosophical undercurrents that often accompany these disciplines, for these currents are, at their very foundation, inimical to the essence of religious thought in general and to the Islamic worldview in particular. Even the slightest amount of these influences is sufficient to taint the pure Islamic spring. In what follows, we shall attempt to offer some detailed reflections on literature and history in particular, and on how these fields may be studied in a manner that safeguards the Muslim's consciousness, purging his soul of the remnants of pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah that now pervades the face of the earth. Literature is the emotional interpretation of life. It springs forth from the same fountain into which pour all philosophies, religions, experiences, and influences within a given environment. Indeed, literature may be among the most powerful forces shaping one's emotional conception of life, imprinting the human soul with a distinctive character. Hence, it is imperative that we cultivate a literature that emanates from the Islamic worldview. Perhaps it is fitting here to offer a detailed word on the methodology of Islamic literature. Like all other arts, literature is a profound expression of living values that stir the artist's soul. These values may differ from one person to another, from one environment to another, and from one era to another. Nonetheless, they always emerge from a particular conception of life and its interrelations between man and the universe and between human beings themselves. Thus, it is futile to attempt to strip literature or any art, for that matter, of the values it seeks to express, whether directly or through their impact upon human perception. If such an endeavour were to succeed, though it is, in truth, impossible, what would remain before us would be nothing but hollow phrases, empty lines, meaningless sounds, or lifeless masses devoid of soul. Equally futile is the attempt to sever values from the overarching conception of existence and life, from their interconnections between man and the cosmos, between living beings and events, and between human beings themselves. Whether one is consciously aware of it or not, every human being harbours a particular perception of life, and this perception inevitably shapes his valuation of existence and colours his responses to it. Islam offers a distinct world view, a particular conceptualization of life from which flow unique values. It is only natural, then, that the artistic expression of these values, or of their impact upon the artist's soul, should bear a unique character. The most defining feature of Islam is that it is a grand, dynamic and creative faith, one that fills the void in the human soul and in life itself. It exhausts human potential in both feeling and action, in both consciousness and movement, leaving no room for aimless anxiety or fruitless contemplation that yields nothing but abstract images and idle musings. Even in the realm of reflection and longing, Islam remains rooted in practical realism. Every contemplation is an act of comprehension or an attempt to grasp the nature of cosmic or human relationships, affirming the bond between the creator and the created, or between the elements of this existence. Every longing is a driving force towards the realization of an objective, no matter how lofty or distant that goal may be. Islam was sent to elevate and refine life, not to passively accept its reality in any given time or place, nor merely to document its various impulses and restraints, its tendencies and limitations, whether in a specific period or over the long span of history. The mission of Islam has always been to propel life towards renewal, growth and advancement, to unleash human potential towards creativity, liberation and ascension. From this perspective, literature or art that springs from the Islamic worldview may not concern itself excessively with depicting human frailty or indulging in its extensive portrayal. Naturally, it does not seek to justify such weakness, let alone embellish it, under the pretext that it is a reality that must neither be denied nor concealed. Islam does not deny the existence of human weakness, but it also recognizes the presence of human strength. It understands that its mission is to empower strength over weakness, to strive towards elevating and refining humanity, not to justify its shortcomings or adorn them in deceptive garb. Thus, literature or art that emanates from the Islamic worldview may, on occasion, touch upon moments of human frailty, but it does not linger upon them. Rather, it pauses only long enough to lift humanity from the abyss of such moments, to liberate it from the shackles of necessity and its oppressive weight. It does not do so merely in adherence to the narrow conventional sense of ethics, but rather in alignment with the very essence of the Islamic worldview and the nature of Islam itself, one that is ever committed to renewing and refining life, never content with its mere reality in any given moment or phase. The Islamic perspective does not believe in man's passivity on this earth, nor in the insignificance of the role he plays in renewing and elevating life. Hence, literature or art that springs from the Islamic worldview does not call out to the human being with his weakness, deficiency and dissent, nor does it fill the void of his emotions and life with the fleeting shadows of sensual pleasures, or with cravings that create nothing but anxiety, confusion, envy and apathy. Instead, it calls out to this being with aspirations of elevation and freedom, filling the emptiness of his life and emotions with human objectives that renew and refine existence, both in the conscience of the individual and in the reality of the community. Moralistic sermons are not the path of literature or art that emanates from the Islamic perspective. for such a method is primitive and by its very nature is not an artistic endeavour. Likewise, the function of this literature or art is not to falsify human personality or the reality of life, nor to depict human existence in an idealized form that has no foundation in reality. Rather, it is an honest rendering of the latent or manifest potentialities within man and an equally honest depiction of the objectives of life that befit a world of human beings, not a pack of wolves. Literature or art that arises from the Islamic perspective is inherently directed, for Islam itself is a continuous movement of renewal and elevation in life. It does not accept the status quo of any moment or generation, nor does it justify or embellish reality merely because it exists. Its principal mission is to transform and improve this reality, inspiring a perpetual movement of creative reformation, ever generating new manifestations of life. In this, it may momentarily converge with literature or art, shaped by the materialist interpretation of history, but only for a fleeting instant before they part ways. For in that artistic vision, class struggle is the axis around which developmental movement revolves. Islam, however, does not ascribe such paramount significance to class struggle, for its outlook on human objectives is broader and loftier. It does not condone social injustice, nor does it approve of it, nor does it urge people to accept it or revel in it. Rather, Islam actively works to combat and replace it. Yet its movement is not built upon class hatred, but rather upon the desire to honour man, to elevate him beyond the depths of subjugation to need and necessity, and to liberate his creative humanity from being confined solely to food, drink, and the hungers of the flesh. Thus, the axis around which growth and renewal revolve in the Islamic paradigm is the advancement of humanity as a whole, propelling it towards liberation and elevation, towards creativity and invention. Along this path, Islam acknowledges the pains and constraints of social classes not to perpetuate them, but to shatter these chains and alleviate these sufferings. It does not belittle human suffering, but neither does it employ class hatred as a means to eliminate it. For hatred itself is a shackle that hinders humanity's ascent towards higher realms. As for how Islam addresses these pains in a practical and realistic manner, neither through mere preaching nor through fantasy, that is a discussion for another time. What matters here is to affirm that Islamic literature or art is inherently directed, guided by the very nature of the Islamic vision of life and the interrelations of the human being within it. It is also guided by the very essence of the Islamic methodology itself, a methodology that is inherently dynamic, propelling towards creation and innovation, towards refinement and elevation. I do not mean by this a form of imposed direction, as advocated by the proponents of materialist historical interpretation. Rather, I mean that when the human soul is moulded by the Islamic worldview, it alone will inspire artistic expressions distinct from those inspired by materialist perspectives or any other worldview. For artistic expression is nothing but an extension of the soul's inner reality, just as human conduct in life is an expression of the self. Finally, Islam does not wage war against the arts themselves, but it does challenge certain concepts and values conveyed through these arts. In their place, it establishes within the realm of the soul new concepts and values capable of inspiring creative and aesthetic visions, capable of producing artistic expressions of greater beauty and freedom. These, then, naturally spring forth from the essence of the Islamic perspective, shaped by its distinctive attributes. This should not be misconstrued as a prohibition against European literature for the Muslim youth. What we mean is merely the exercise of choice and discernment. Within these literatures, there exist elements that align, at least in some aspects, with the Islamic spirit. Not because they explicitly advocate virtues and condemn vices, for literature is not a pulpit for preaching and moral exhortation, but because they approach life with a spiritual vision that transcends mere materialism, and because they acknowledge the moral values inherent in human existence. This type of literature resonates in its essence with the broader Islamic approach, and thus, with careful selection, it remains worthy of study. History is a branch of literature, yet it possesses a unique nature and a profound significance. For history is nothing less than an interpretation of the events of life, and as such, it inevitably reflects the philosophy and overarching worldview that informs it. Its interpretations, therefore, shape a perception of existence that may differ fundamentally from the Islamic concept of life and history. Beyond this, most historians, being predominantly European, have made the history of Europe the focal point of world history. In this, they may be excused by the natural tendencies of the human mind, setting aside Western self-interest and European arrogance. However, when our youth study history imbued with such a spirit and methodology, they emerge with two fallacious beliefs. The first, that spiritual forces play little or no role in the progression of time. The second, that Europe alone is the driving force of history, and that Islam, in particular, has had only a negligible influence. The impact of these two misconceptions is both harmful and grave, whether in shaping a general understanding of life, ethics and behavior, or in fostering a sense of Islamic pride in the face of the overwhelming tide of Western influence. It is imperative, then, that we establish a universal history from an Islamic perspective, one that interprets events through the lens of the Islamic worldview. We must not allow the European perspective to monopolize this crucial task. Europe must be placed in history in its proper and rightful position, no more, no less. And we must illuminate the role of humanity as a whole, and the role of Islam in particular, in shaping the course of history. History is not merely a collection of events, rather, it is the interpretation of these events and the discovery of the visible and hidden links that bind their scattered fragments together, transforming them into a cohesive whole, its elements interwoven, its moments extending across time and space like a living organism stretching forth in its existence. For man to comprehend an event, interpret it, and connect it with what preceded and followed it, he must possess the readiness to grasp all the constituents of the human psyche, spiritual, intellectual and instinctual, as well as all the foundations of human life, both moral and material. He must open his soul, mind and senses to the event, responding to its impact upon his faculties, and rejecting nothing of his intuitive responses except after careful scrutiny, examination and critical reflection. Thus, Islamic history must be rewritten upon new foundations and with a different methodology. The life of Islam must be viewed from a fresh perspective under new lights, so that all its mysteries and radiances may be revealed, and its elements and components may be fully disclosed. In this renewed study, the Islamic sources must be the primary reference, but only after the researcher immerses his mind, soul and senses in the atmosphere of Islam as a creed, a movement, a philosophy and a system, and in the reality of Islamic life as an integral part of the lived human experience. This immersion is essential, not merely for understanding that life, but for perceiving it as a living entity, and for comprehending the place of events and occurrences within the body of this living being. It is exceedingly difficult for a researcher to truly and intimately grasp any period of human history unless he engages with it in its entirety, responding to it with his whole being, and living within its ambience, exposed to all its influences and inspirations. This is not a trait exclusive to Islamic history, although it is more pronounced in its case, for the components of this life differ significantly in their nature and essence from those of the present age. It is nearly impossible to conceive of a complete study of Islamic life without a comprehensive understanding of the Islamic creed, its conception of divinity, the cosmos, life and man, as well as the nature of the Muslim's response to this creed and his approach to life as a whole under its shade. These characteristics can only be fully grasped by a Muslim researcher who actively participates in an Islamic movement. These are the essential qualities that must be present in any endeavor to rewrite Islamic history. One must discern the true motivations behind people's actions throughout this historical narrative and their relation to events, developments and transformations. All of this must be linked to the essence of the Islamic creed and its revolutionary spirit, not merely in its external form and practical steps, but in its interpretation of cosmic relationships, human relations, and social structures. It must also be connected to its vision of governance, economic policies, legislative methods, and modes of implementation, all of which are fundamental components of life and, by extension, of the historical narrative of this life. military battles, political treaties, international conflicts, and similar matters which history often concerns itself with more than anything else are all governed by deeper factors that must be brought to light in the writing of history. These underlying factors are what researchers differ in understanding and evaluating, each influenced by the philosophy that governs his thought and perception, his very approach to life itself. The Muslim researcher who actively partakes in an Islamic movement holds a distinct advantage in the study of Islamic life, for his perception of life is intrinsically connected to the true nature of these determining factors that shape the course of history. He is thus better equipped to internalize and comprehend them, responding to them in a manner that is both complete and authentic. Through his understanding of the nature of the Islamic creed and the way Muslims respond to it, he can measure the driving forces behind Islamic life in that historical period, the human values embedded within it, and the reasons for victory and defeat at every stage. He can envision both the external and internal life of those human communities, whether in the cradle of early Islam or in the lands to which it spread, thus adding to the outward aspects which Western observers often limit themselves to, all the spiritual dimensions that Islam considers an undeniable reality, taking them into account in the unfolding of time and the shaping of life in every era and place. Since Islamic life is but a phase of human life, and Muslims are but a community among mankind bound by time and space, and since Islam itself is a universal human message unrestricted by temporal or spatial limits, Islamic history cannot be separated from the broader history of humankind. Undoubtedly, that period was shaped by Islam's confrontation with the forces of ignorance, jahiliyyah, by the factors prevailing at the dawn of its emergence, and in turn, it influenced the subsequent experiences of humanity, particularly in the lands it reached or those that neighboured it. Therefore, in writing Islamic history, it is imperative to understand the global state of affairs before the advent of Islam, the conditions of human societies on earth, especially in regard to religious beliefs and all associated philosophies, ideologies and theories, as well as the social structures, governance systems, economic policies, societal relationships, ethics, customs, and prevailing thoughts. Only in this light can the true role and nature of Islam be discerned, and the world's response to this new order, whether in acceptance or rejection, be accurately interpreted, along with a complete understanding of the causes of conflict, the factors of victory and defeat, and the elements of interaction, confrontation, and mutual influence throughout the ages. If grasping the global state of affairs at that time is essential, then understanding the conditions of the Arabian Peninsula, envisioning its life in all its dimensions, is even more crucial, for it was the first cradle of Islam on one hand and the centre of its expansion and dissemination on the other. Was it a mere coincidence that this messenger appeared with this religion in this specific place, at this precise moment in time? Or was there an ordained order, an intended purpose, a deliberate arrangement whereby all these phenomena converged as they did, to fulfill a particular role, one whose least consequence was to redraw the map of the world, both on the plane of visible reality and in the realm of human consciousness, into the form it has assumed since that distant time? Perhaps this thought leads us to study Muhammad, the messenger, within this cosmic context of history. Perhaps within his very person, his lineage, the environment in which he was raised, the customs of his surroundings, and all the factors that shape an individual's existence there, lie purposeful elements and preordained circumstances. It was no mere accident that he was singled out from the vast gatherings of humankind, that a divine call was directed toward him alone, you. And so he was summoned to undertake this cosmic event, unparalleled in both precedent and consequence. Perhaps, too, this leads us to study the nature of this event, the comprehensive idea it embodies, before delving into the study of the historical transformations and upheavals that unfolded upon its foundation. Thus, a fully developed vision of all the surrounding conditions and circumstances that gave rise to the responses recorded in the annals of Islam's history will emerge. And in this light, these responses can be accurately interpreted, with a judgment that encompasses all its essential elements and considerations. Thus, history becomes an inward contemplation and a resonance within the conscience of things, people, times and events. It connects with the law of the universe and the stages of human progression, becoming a living entity, a substance of life. And when research follows the method we have outlined, when the fundamental components of the nature of the call, the nature of the messenger, and the nature of the environment that receive both the call and the messenger emerge, when the essential elements become manifest. The nature of the human society that witnessed the birth of Islam, the beliefs and ideas that dominated it at that time. When these fundamental components stand revealed, it becomes easier to trace their activity into action and transformation. The steps of the call, during the lifetime of the messenger, peace and blessings be upon him, can then be depicted and understood. For these steps were shaped by all these components, influenced by their interplay. And thus for us and for the people of this age, it becomes possible to comprehend how the messenger chose his men, of what essence these men were, how he moulded and prepared them for the great mission, how he established his system, and upon what foundations this system was built. How did the Arabian Peninsula transform into the cradle of this new faith, of this new order? What, within its nature, circumstances, men, houses, clans, social structures, economic conditions, geography and vital forces made it receptive to this event or opposed it? These and other inquiries paint the picture of the first phase of Islam's existence, or its history, what may rightfully be called Islam, in the era of the messenger. Then follows the second phase, the expansion of Islam. That moment when Islam spread far and wide, reaching the East and the West in an astonishing surge, an outpouring of power and vitality unparalleled in the annals of history, not only in terms of military conquests, but also in spiritual, intellectual and social influence. Indeed, in its totality, this expansion marked a profound transformation in the course of history upon the advent of this new faith and its extraordinary spread. Here, the value of the method we have indicated becomes clear, enabling an examination of Islam's acts of demolition and construction across the vast lands it reached, its interaction with prevailing ideas and beliefs, with social structures under its shade, with economic conditions, historical legacies, and human circumstances in the most fertile and civilized regions of that era. The Islamic expansion did not halt at the borders reached by its military conquests. Indeed, the intellectual wave and the civilization it fostered extended far beyond the limits of the Islamic world. It is imperative to study the effects of this expansion, both within and beyond these borders, examining its impact on Islamic civilization itself, as well as on the non-Islamic world. For this world took from Islam and gave to it. It was influenced by Islam and in turn influenced it. A study of these interactions, in light of the method we have outlined, would yield an unprecedented portrayal of history, one imbued with a unique vitality and character. It would offer a vision of human civilization and its living trajectories that diverges to a greater or lesser extent from the narrative customarily drawn by Western historians and which we ourselves have been conditioned to accept. Then comes the period of the recession of Islam's influence. Through the lens of our method and the preceding historical phases, we can discern the causes and factors, both internal and external, behind this ebb. Were these factors intrinsic to the Islamic creed and system, as those who cast doubts upon Islam claim? Or were they the making of Muslims themselves, or the work of Islam's adversaries in the non-Islamic world? Was this recession complete or partial, superficial or profound? What impact did this decline have on the course of history, on shaping human conditions, on the principles of thought and conduct, on international and human relations? How do the ideas, systems and beliefs that emerged in its wake compare to their counterparts in Islam? What has humanity gained, and what has it lost as a result of Islam's retreat and the ascendancy of European influence, which still casts its shadow upon us? Thus, the discussion on Islam's present condition becomes natural and timely, grounded in clear and explicit foundations, not dictated by emotion or bias from any side. And so, in light of our method, human history unfolds as a continuous chain of interwoven events, with Islam's role in this history becoming distinct past, present, and through the lens of the past and present, even into the future. These are but brief indications of the intellectual framework that prepares the way for Islam's actual existence. Yet none of this will bear fruit unless the believing community on this earth realizes that this religion is a creed, one that manifests in the exclusive devotion of all worship to God alone, and consequently in the exclusive attribution of sovereignty to Him alone. Islam is a way of life that translates this creed into action. And unless they also grasp that there is a suspension in the existence of Islam today, and that the first step must be to restore its existence as a belief, only then can its full existence follow. And they must hold firm in the certainty that the future belongs to this faith despite this temporary suspension. And God is the one from whom help is sought at the crossroads. And now where are we heading? We must pause for a moment to ask ourselves this question and to direct our course towards the path we truly seek. After 2 consecutive world wars, the world today appears divided into 2 great blocks, the communist bloc in the east and the capitalist bloc in the west. This is how it seems on the surface, how it is spoken of, how it settles in the minds of men. Yet we believe this division is superficial, not real. It is a division over interests, not principles, a struggle over commodities and markets, not over creeds and ideas. For in truth, the intellectual outlook of Europe and America is not fundamentally different from that of Russia. Both are founded upon materialist conceptions of life. If Russia, China and their like have embraced Marxist materialism, then Europe and America differ little in their materialistic view of life and history. There is nothing beyond the materialist thought that dominates the West, reducing ethics to mere utility, encouraging ruthless competition for markets and wealth, nothing beyond this thought, which denies the spiritual dimension of life, rejects faith in anything beyond laboratory experiments, scorns abstract ideals, and denies the existence of intrinsic truths in things except for their functional utility, as the philosophy of pragmatism advocates, nothing beyond this except Marxist materialism in another form. There is no essential difference between American and Russian thought, only differences in economic and social conditions. What prevents the average American from becoming a communist is not a worldview that rejects materialist interpretations of life, but rather the existence of opportunities for wealth and the relatively high wages of workers. Let us not be deceived by the apparent intensity of the conflict between the Eastern and Western blocs. Both possess only a materialist conception of life. Both are close in their intellectual nature. Both are not battling over principle or belief, but rather over domination in the world and profit in the markets. And we are these very markets. The true and profound struggle is, in reality, between Islam and both the Western and Eastern blocs alike. For Islam is the only true force that stands against the power of materialist thought, which is the common creed of Europe, America, Russia and China. Islam alone contains the all-encompassing, harmonious vision of existence and life. It replaces the strife and conflict of human society with mutual solidarity. It establishes a spiritual foundation for life, linking it to the Creator in the heavens while guiding its course upon the earth. It does not reduce life to the mere pursuit of material objectives, though fruitful material endeavour is, in itself, an act of worship in Islam. Indeed, spiritual religions, foremost among them, Christianity, reject both the materialism of Europe and America and the materialism of communism, for both share a nature that contradicts the spiritual conception of life. Yet Christianity, as I see it, does not constitute a positive force in confronting these new materialist ideologies. For it has dwindled into a passive, individualistic faith, isolated from the dynamism of life. It has failed to keep pace with the ever-evolving realities of human civilization across successive generations. It has not been able to command the course of worldly affairs because, as shaped by the Church and its councils, it remains detached from the realities of life. Moreover, Christianity, in its final form, is incapable of adapting to the constantly changing social and economic conditions, for it lacks within its essence any guiding vision for practical worldly life. Islam, on the other hand, is a comprehensive cosmic system. It contains belief, law, and a social and economic order that is governed by moral consciousness and divine legislation capable of growth in its particulars and applications. It offers humanity a complete and encompassing vision of existence and life, a realistic and practical system for society, and a detailed legal framework that is adaptable to the evolving needs of human civilization. Islam establishes its order upon a holistic perception of life, one that rejects materialist thinking and bases human conduct upon spiritual and moral principles, thereby denying the notion of immediate utilitarianism. In this, it stands in direct confrontation with the materialist mindset that dominates both the Eastern and Western blocs. It lifts human existence above the shallow horizons that Europe, America, and Russia alike seek to attain. From this brief survey, it becomes clear that the real struggle of the future will not be between capitalism and communism, nor between the Eastern and Western camps. Rather, it will be between materialism wherever it manifests and Islam. Or more precisely, it will be between the system that establishes servitude to God alone, liberating mankind from servitude to fellow men, and all other man-made systems, which are founded upon the subjugation of man by man. Both the Eastern and Western camps are fully aware of this reality, and despite their rivalries and contradictions, they work together to crush all Islamic revival movements wherever they emerge and to wage war against Islam in every possible way, on every front. This is a truth that must be understood by those who call to God, so they do not fall prey to the illusion of the apparent conflict between these various camps and ideologies. Islam is the only true force that both blocs fear and take into account. What remains is for the followers of Islam to recognize this truth and to build their strategy upon this foundation. Today, Islamic revival movements stand at a crossroads. The correct starting point upon the right path is to discern the essential condition for the existence or non-existence of Islam today, to firmly acknowledge that Islam's existence today has been suspended and to not be alarmed by this grave realization, nor to be overwhelmed by its enormity, such that they shrink from confronting it or proclaiming it openly. They must recognize that their mission is to re-establish Islam anew, or more precisely to restore it once again to a state of existence, after this existence has been interrupted for a time. This is one path. The other path is for these movements, even for a single moment, to assume that Islam still exists, that those who profess Islam and bear Muslim names are truly Muslims, that the secular systems prevailing across the world today are Islamic systems, like the one established by Ataturk and the systems that followed his model, just as Wilfred Cantwell Smith and his likes, along with those deceived by them and those who deceive others, seek to instill in the minds of people. This is one path and that is another, and today Islamic revival movements stand at the crossroads. If they take the first path, they will tread upon the way of God and his guidance. They will recognize that they are facing a suspension in the very existence of Islam. They will understand that their mission is the very mission undertaken by Muhammad, the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him and the first Muslim community. And they will inevitably encounter what the messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, and his companions endured: persecution and torture, patience and steadfastness, and ultimately divine support, victory and establishment upon the earth. But if they take the second path, the one pointed out to them by Mr. Wilfred Cantwell Smith and his ilk, along with those deceived by them and those who deceive others, they will be chasing a mirage in which they will see from afar turbans that twist divine words from their rightful places, that sell God's revelations for a paltry price, that raise the banner of Islam over mosques built upon falsehood, and that plaster Islamic slogans upon camps of depravity and moral decay. Today, Islamic revival movements are scattered across the face of the earth. They have stormed the very strongholds of Christendom in the heart of America and Europe. They are rising anew in Asia and Africa despite all the vast resources that Christendom and Zionism have marshalled against them, despite all the systems and apparatuses they have put in place to crush them. Yet these movements may be led astray by deceptive illusions, or they may tread the straight path. And our hope in God is great that He may open hearts to the truth and unveil the veils from the eyes, that they may see reality as it truly is. And God is the one who guides, grants success and aid.